Members of council, if you can please take your seats. This meeting is now resumed. Before the recess, council was considering the mayor's first key item, CD 26.5, on emergency shelter services update. Before we return to that item, I would take the release of member holds. Councillor Matlow.
Madam Speaker, thank you for allowing me a brief opportunity to share some good news with all of you. You may remember that a few years ago we initiated the Toronto Senior Strategy, which gained us the honor by the World Health Organization of being one of the newest global age-friendly cities due to the work that we've done together. So today we received another award. The Ontario Age-Friendly Community Recognition Award was presented to the City of Toronto, and it says, for your leadership in creating a welcoming community that enables seniors to live independent, active, and healthy lives. And I want to thank Premier Kathleen Wynne and Minister Deepika Demerla, who's the Minister of Seniors Affairs, for this really wonderful recognition of the work that we've done together. And I want to specifically recognize Andrea Austin, our remarkable lead on the senior strategy, staff lead, along with our Toronto Seniors Forum, our expert panel, along with our accountability table, for the really wonderful work that they're doing. And I just want to give everyone the heads up that I believe in May we're going to be receiving phase 2 of the senior strategy, and it's something that I think all of us should be proud of, because this strategy is all about creating a city that is age-friendly, that serves whether you are in your 80s, with a mobility challenge, or God forbid in your 40s in a wheelchair, or you are a young parent pushing a stroller. It's about building a respectful, caring, and vibrant city that all of us can participate in and be, and know that it's inclusive for all of us together. So thank you very much. And again, members of council, this is yours, this is ours, and I want to acknowledge all of you for your support as we continue our advocacy for seniors in the City of Toronto. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Mihevc.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to note that we have Mayor Barry Verbonovic here from Kitchener area, who's been a good colleague of many of us at the Federation of Municipalities, and noting as well that he's waiting for his LRT vehicles just as much as we are here in the City of Toronto. So we're waiting together.
Thank you. Councillor Hart, are you ready for the announcement? Pardon?
They're not all here yet, sorry.
Okay, just let me know. Do we have any quick releases? No. Okay, we'll go back to page 5, CD 26.5. We can put the list on the screen. Councillor Mihevc, questions?
Big Joe.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just have 2 questions. I'll ask them all at once because I think they need to be stated publicly. One is April 15th is upon us, and that ends the winter respite program. A lot of the colds are closing. If you could update this council and our community on what is happening post April 15th. And secondly, give us a very brief update on the 10 new shelters that we had approved as a City Council, both on the policy side and on the funding side.
Through the Chair, with regard to the respite sites, we have confirmed that 5 of the 8 will continue on through 2018. A 6th we are currently negotiating with at the moment, and we know that the final 2, the Better Living Centre and 354 Davenport, we will have to find alternate sites for. We have both of those sites until mid-May, and we're quite confident that we will find 2 alternate sites for those 2 locations. So that is the respite sites. In terms of the shelter infrastructure, So as I had mentioned earlier, we are on track to open 8 shelters this year. We have 6 confirmed locations, and we have 2 that we are actively negotiating to open shelters at 2 other locations. In 2019, we have a strong plan for the George Street revitalization work, as well as 3 other shelter sites. And in 2020, we're looking at 4 shelters in that year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think my first question would be to the city manager. Oh, it's left for Ottawa. No. But maybe the general manager could handle as well. 10 of the first new recommendations before us that came to CDR directives to other levels of government. Federal government, provincial government. I don't think it's any secret that healthcare is provincial jurisdiction, immigration is federal jurisdiction, but we've asked these other levels of government to be partners. We've asked for various communications to these other levels of government. We haven't seen anything at committee that indicates that communication is made. What is the normal process when council directs staff to communicate to another level of government?
Sorry, through the Speaker. Normally we would work with the City's Intergovernmental Office and the clerks to draft that communication and reflects Council's decision.
So it's regular correspondence. Now, would the committee chair or committee members normally get a copy of that correspondence?
Not that I'm aware, but I'm sure we could share that.
Right.
That was the wish.
Yes, I think that's preferred because the bulk of our motions are asking other levels of government to participate in various cost-shared programs. So having a record of that communication, I think, for follow-up is very important. I guess through you, Madam Speaker, to the General Manager, I know there's a push on now to build 1,000 new permanent beds, and that is a 3-year program?
Through the Chair, that's correct.
And that's listed as a cost of about $178 million.
Through the Chair, the capital costs are $178 million, and by 2021, the operating costs would be $35 million.
Right. So that's not in the capital plan, the preliminary capital plan. So what's the plan?
Through the Chair, that is in the capital plan.
In your budget briefing of January 23rd, you mentioned that it was not in the capital plan. Has something changed since budget was adopted?
Through the Chair, yes, that was added during the budget process.
So as we add the 1,000 permanent beds, those would be year-round beds?
Through the Chair, that's correct.
Do we run the risk that we take away incentive to build either transitional or supportive housing if we make our shelter system year-round permanent?
Through the Chair, I don't think so. I believe with the growing city that we would need to have an adequate shelter system as well as a system with supportive housing, affordable housing. It is a continuum.
When it comes to the recent federal announcement, I have a figure on page 8 of the staff report of a figure of $2.1 billion over 11 years. Is that still an accurate figure?
Through the Chair, this references the National Housing Strategy from the federal government.
Yes.
It is the federal government's announcement, so
Okay.
we don't have a lot of detail on that.
We don't know what our share will be, do we? No?
Through the Chair, not at this point, but there are ongoing negotiations.
Okay. When it comes to the mountain or load of motions that are coming forward from CDR and then from Council, I realize it's a monumental task to get on top of them. Some of them are quite onerous, take a lot of work, a lot of staff time. Do you have the resources to respond to those? Because some of the Admittedly, some of them are directed to the deputy city manager, some of them are directed to the city manager. Not all fall in your lap. But are the resources there to respond to all of these motions over the last 90 days?
Through the chair, it is true there is an awful lot of work to do. We're working very closely with many other divisions to support us in this work. We have asked for and received support from Council to have some additional resources made available. And as we continue with the work, should we require additional resources, we would come back to Council for that.
Now, based on the reading of these motions, primarily from, I guess, Community Development and Recreation, and I thank my committee members for their for contributing to this vital conversation. Do you think that when you report back and you implement some of those strategies?
Thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Your time is up. So. Oh, okay. Mayor Tory.
I know that Councillor Mahavik looked after this. He ate my lunch, but I had asked Mayor Vervanovich from Kitchener to come up, and I know he's been introduced. No, not at all. But I just wanted to add, I don't know if you made reference to this, but I wanted to say in his presence, first of all, welcome. But I also wanted to just say that, you know, we're really trying to make something real of this Toronto-Waterloo corridor because it's a very powerful tool for selling the Toronto region. It's certainly been helpful to us in all of our discussions with the different companies that are looking to come here to Toronto, and he's been, in that regard, a very good partner because, you know, there was a day when people would have said, well, you know, why would Waterloo get into, you know, any kind of cooperation with Toronto and vice versa? And the bottom line answer to that question is because together we're going to be much stronger at attracting bright people, attracting companies, building up our tech ecosystem and so on. And so Barry in that regard has been, Mayor Vervanovich has been a very good partner. We've traveled together to Silicon Valley to try and woo back Canadians who are down there, and we will continue to do things together. But I just want to say he's not only welcome here, but he's welcome as a partner of ours in trying to build up a very important sector of our region, and I think the rising tide will lift all boats. So welcome, Mayor Vervanovich. Thank you.
Councillor Hart, are you ready yet?
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to welcome students from the Scarborough University of Toronto campus, Alexander Flynn and her students who are studying human geography and city studies, specifically the City Structures and City Choices course. They have provided a number of counselors today with briefing books on various subjects. I'm one of those counselors. I think maybe Councillor Davis is. And Councillor Lee, my colleague here, will list all of the counselors that have been involved. I just want to thank each and every one of you. I found it very enlightening, and I can't wait to read the briefing book you prepared me. Thanks very much for coming. Councillor Lee.
Councillor Troisi, questions?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Are we done? Oh.
Councillor Lee.
Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Hart. In addition to Councillor Hart and myself, Councillor Ainsley, Councillor Davis, Councillor Holland, Councillor Karigianis, Councillor Metlow, Councillor McMahon, Councillor Perks, Councillor Shan, Councillor Thompson, and Councillor Wong Tam receiving briefing books from the students. In my case, it's a briefing book on transit in Toronto, and especially in Scarborough. And the coursework they're doing is with regards to local government management and policy making. And it is good to be able to read what our students are doing because the future belongs to them, and they have to tell us what is needed by our future city to make life more enjoyable, the quality of life that we live here, and to create employment as well as a safe place to live. Thank you very much for coming down and giving them a big hand.
Councillor Troisi, questions?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My question's regarding the respite sites. I'm aware that we were in a crisis this winter, but would you agree that community recreation centers are not an appropriate place or location for respite sites, especially those that impact other vulnerable communities like Regent Park?
Through the chair, I would agree that in the normal course of business, we would not want to utilize community centers for a respite site. We did operate warming centers out of a couple of the sites this winter with the rapid increase in demand in a very short period of time.
In moving forward, perhaps I would believe that you would find it very useful if city councilors could identify some locations in advance. Like I look at some empty lots that are around the city right now. Would that be something you would entertain?
Through the chair, right now we're working with the Office of Emergency Management to come up with a very robust plan for the future. There are a number of emergency plans, as you know, within the city for different things, fires, disasters, and others. There has not been emergency plans put in place for this type of situation. So we want to work with them, work with council to identify the best approach for the future should something like this happen again.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fragadakis, questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. So I just wanted to drill down and understand how solutions are being developed. So I wanted to start with 354 George Street. So I was wondering what was the previous use of 354 George Street?
Through the chair, that is a provincially owned site. It was a former youth detention center.
Sorry, I'm having some trouble hearing you.
That is a provincially owned site, a former youth detention center.
So when did it become vacant?
Through the chair, I wouldn't have that information. I understand for many years.
For many years, okay. So one of the recommendations is that council requests that the provincial government continue to work with the city on identifying additional surplus properties for emergency shelter, supportive and affordable housing uses. So is that not already going on in an informal way?
Yes, through you, Madam Speaker, it is.
Okay, and when did those talks start?
Those talks have been underway for many, many months. I'm going to say we started those discussions early last year.
Okay. Another recommendation is that council request the provincial government to provide a response to council's previous request to immediately reintroduce funding mechanisms to offset the cost of sudden and prolonged increases in demand for emergency shelter space in Toronto. So when did we make that request, and what was the provincial government's response?
Through the chair, this is the CHIPI funding, and we have been negotiating with the province ongoing for the last couple of years.
Okay. And what's been the provincial response?
Through the chair, the province has provided additional funding in many other areas, such as Home for Good and other programs, but the allocation for the CHIPI funding has remained what it is.
Okay. Do the LHINs play any role in dealing with the homelessness crisis?
Through the chair, we are currently working very closely with the LHINs to identify health support services within the emergency shelter system. Right now, we have an agreement that they will pilot health care services within 5 of our new shelters that we have opening up this year.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Wong-Tam, questions?
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and through you to staff. Regarding the 5 out of 6 winter respites that will continue to operate, can you give us the addresses?
Through the chair, I can. I can't give those to you off the top of my head, but I can give you the names of the locations.
Sure, that would be great.
So it would be Margaret's, St. Felix, Progress, 705 Progress, 354 George, 21 Cowan,
Davenport.
And there's a 6th one that you're negotiating that may stay open past April 15th. What would that be?
Apologies, that is the Cowan site.
That is the Cowan site. So that brings us to 5. Do you have the 6th?
Margaret's is 2 sites. Margaret's is 2 sites.
Oh, Margaret's is 2 sites, Councillor.
Okay, thank you, Member. Thank you, that's very helpful. With respect to the number of facilities that you've negotiated that will be open as brand new shelters this year, I think you said that you're on track to open now 6 in 2018, that there's 2 more sites being negotiated. Where are you in the terms of those negotiations?
Through you, Madam Speaker, so we are negotiating with the property owners as we speak.
And have you submitted offers? Or are you in the counter-offer negotiating stage?
So we are still in the dance of negotiations in terms of trying to negotiate the final purchase price.
And so with the 6 that's already on track to open, plus the 2 that may be successfully secured, that brings us to 8. How many beds will that bring us in 2018? Total numbers.
Through the chair, it would be 291 and 240.
Okay, so we're still quite far off away from the 1,000 mark.
Through the chair, it's a three-year plan.
But City Council did say that should you be able to secure those additional sites, the money would be available this year.
Through the chair, that's correct. If we are able to move any of the other sites up, then we will do that.
Okay, and so with respect to the new partnership that's put into place with the Toronto Real Estate Board, I know that you've had some significant responses from some of the TREB members. They've brought forward some potential prospect listings. How many of them, how many prospect listings were advanced to your attention?
So we have 14 shortlisted properties that came through the TREB e-blast.
Okay. And out of the 14 shortlisted properties, they're shortlisted based on their physical criteria, that they can be retrofitted successfully, that they're close to services, additional services and transit lines. Is that correct?
Correct.
And they're properly zoned, ready to go?
I believe so, yes.
And are you able to give us a sense of if even 14 of them, or perhaps even half of them, are successfully measured and evaluated, that you can move towards an offer, how many more beds will how many more shelter beds could that possibly produce for us this year?
Through the chair, that would be totally dependent on the individual site or sites that were available. So our target is for 80 to 90 beds on a site. Could be as low as 60, could be as high as 90.
So with the 14 shortlisted, let's just say on average, if you can even get 50% of them online, that's about 7 new facilities, each one producing 80 to 100 beds, you will be on track to produce and create 1,000 new beds this year. Is that correct? If those things lined up.
Through the chair, if all of that lined up, that's correct.
Okay, that is correct. And with respect to, and thank you very much, that's quite encouraging. With respect to the number of beds that were in the pipeline to be produced and to be created this year, how many of them are already spoken for beds, such as replacement beds through the George Street revitalization?
Through the chair, as I had mentioned earlier, 121 of the 291 are new beds, 170 are replacement, the other 240 are new.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry I missed that earlier.
No.
So even if, by way of even successfully securing 50% of the shortlisted new sites that have been brought to your attention by TREB members, you could still meet the target market, the target goal.
Through the chair, again, if all of those other very challenging pieces line up, including construction, renovation, all of that stuff, that is correct.
Thank you. Councillor Holliday, questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. Through you to the General Manager, I wondered if you could explain the difference between an emergency shelter and a drop-in center. Just quickly, is there any basic points that separate the two of them?
Through the chair, the emergency shelters are permanent fixed facilities that are in place to provide housing, temporary housing to individuals, along with many other services, access to employment, access to health, those types of things.
Yep.
The drop-in services, there are daytime drop-in services that provide food and basic services, and there's also the respite sites, which we've opened this winter. Again, that provide a safe place to come in out of the cold, food, some access to services, referral services.
But they're different. They're different entities, they're different functions.
Through the chair, they are different.
So recommendation number 12 from the committee talks about using the existing shelter standards as the basis for the development of the interim standards for the 24-hour homeless programs that are not shelters. And I take it they're referring to standards for the drop-in centers. Are you not doing this already, developing standards for the drop-in centers?
Through the chair, that is correct, and we would be using a basic framework from our existing shelter standards to develop those interim standards. They're not intended to be exactly the same.
Does recommendation number 12 push you in a direction to make drop-in shelters similar to emergency shelters, because it's pushing you in a way of using one set of standards for the other? And the standard defines the activity, does it not? I'm just trying to understand the effect of number 12. I thought you were already doing that, but the committee saw it fit to underline it even further.
Through the chair, we're using that as a framework, but we're also going to do extensive consultation with the community around those standards, and we don't believe the intention is to be exactly the same.
Okay, great. Number 10, recommendation number 10, mentions looking at surplus properties, including 354 George Street and the Moss Park Armory for emergency shelter, supportive and affordable housing uses. That to me infers that we're going to ask the government to convert the Moss Park Armory into an emergency shelter or some other type of use. Is that how you read that as well?
Through the chair, I believe our interpretation of that is looking for all available options from the provincial and federal government.
Because your recommendations in the report didn't include the armory, so I don't know why it was added. I suppose the last thing I'd like to ask is a little bit about supportive housing. Now, most of this report is about emergency shelter services, and I'll take a moment to comment on what a great report it was to lay out how all of this works and some of the numbers behind it. But we spend a lot of time talking about supportive housing and the need to aspire to some growth on that. I wondered if you could tell me how supportive housing is funded right now with respect to the base funding. I know the provincial and federal governments contribute to that, but is the city contributing something? And how do we determine the size of that program? It's looking at 18,000.
Through the chair, the provincial government currently administers and funds 7,000 supportive housing beds in the province. The city does not. At the moment, the provincial government has started the Homes for Good program, which is a $90 million program focused on providing housing with support services to individuals experiencing homelessness.
So do you take the recommendations of the committee in various pieces here to take it as direction to begin a supportive housing program made by the city? Because that number 18,000 is a lot different than the number that you just quoted me. Are we getting in the business of supportive housing directly?
Through the chair, what we're using the Homes for Good money for is to find housing for individuals experiencing homelessness and bring the support services to those individuals so that they will remain successfully housed in those locations.
The Homes for Good money, but that's not a match to the 18,000. So how would you propose that you're going to make up the gap between the Homes for Good money, which I think was 2,000 people, to 18,000? That's an awful lot. So are you opening a program that will be tax-based?
Through the chair, the way I read that motion is asking the province and the federal government to provide funding to do that.
And then you will administer it?
Through the chair, that's correct.
And if there's a gap between the provincial or federal money for this aspirational goal, how will that be filled? Through a budget submission from you?
Through the chair, I don't believe that's been contemplated in that motion.
Okay, that was your last question. Okay, we'll go to speakers now. Councillor Cressy.
Thank you, Speaker. Let me begin, first of all, by thanking our staff in Shelter Support and Housing Administration, not just for the work that's been done over the last couple months, but the work in developing this report. In January of this year, after the brutal cold and the debates we had in this chamber, our CDR committee took it upon ourselves to ask for a whole series of information in a very compressed timeline. And I think staff delivered in spades, producing what I think is one of the most comprehensive reports on the state of our shelter system that I've ever seen. And I want to commend them and thank them for doing that. We've spent a lot of time in recent months in particular in this council chamber having at times rather fierce debates about how we can ensure we have an adequate and dignified emergency response system for people who are in danger and living rough on the streets or experiencing homelessness. And that's been critical from the point of view of harm reduction and saving lives. But ultimately, we need to commit and double down on what our goal is. And that goal is, yes, providing an emergency response, but ending homelessness. That is and must be our ultimate goal as a city. And to that basis, the debate we have here today and the recommendations that CDR have brought forward is to transition our focus from continuing to scale up our emergency response on the shelter side, but moving towards transitional housing. And that's critical. You know, in recent months, the capacity of our shelter system, the 30% increase in people using it, has exposed the dire need and the dire situations. And I do think our staff have responded. The commitment to opening 1,000 beds, and we're trying to push faster, looking at shelter standards, or drop-in standards, I should say, work that's been done in the last couple of years to at least identify new spaces. But while that work continues to ensure that we have a more dignified and adequate emergency response, until we ensure that we have a pathway out of the shelter system, as opposed to just an entrance into the emergency response, until we ensure we do that, people will continue to experience homelessness. And until we address the health and housing needs, we risk embedding homelessness in our city while we try to confront it. And so that's what the motions that CDR brought forward, for me, are fundamentally about. It is establishing, for the first time since 2009 as a city council, a clear target for supportive housing in this city. It's about establishing an ambitious target, not on the basis of aspirations, but on the basis of need. Because what we know is that there are 14,000 people in our city on the access point waiting list at the province for supportive housing. What we know is that list is demonstrative but not exhaustive of need, and that the Wellesley Institute has said it's closer to 18,000. And so CDR has decided and said that we should establish as a council a target for 18,000 supportive housing beds. That we establish a target for how many beds should be built every year, 1,800 a year over the next 10 years. That we establish a proposed delivery mechanism for this supportive housing program through the provincial government and their Homes for Good program. And we've also proposed a funding mechanism, which is to break this down on a 50-50 basis between the province and the feds at $410 million each. And I want to be clear here, on the federal side, the National Housing Strategy and the $40 billion, we don't know any of the details yet. In fact, the provincial government and the federal government haven't even signed the agreement yet. And so that money's there, that's critical. But we as a city have to clearly articulate what we want to use some of that money for. That's what this is about here today, is articulating the desire to establish the supportive housing target and funding mechanism to do it. And so I'll just close in my remarks to say that there has been a lot of recent discussion on shelters in this city. And that's important, and frankly, there's good reason we've had that discussion, because there aren't enough of them. But now we also, as a city, with equal force, need to scale up our focus on transitioning people out of shelters. And I would encourage all those around this table, including those who will be running for provincial office next month, to commit to this target and to commit to the funding being there when it happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Wong Tam to speak.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I would like to begin my remarks by, first of all, thanking staff for this detailed report. I think we were just as complimentary to them at the CDR committee, simply because the data that's contained in front of you is so full and far more robust than we've ever seen. It's also important to note that the reason we have this information before us is because there have been so many requests and motions that have had to move forward asking for this information to be compiled. And I think that there is something to be noted about the number of motions that have been flying back and forth at CDR, even across this floor of council, as we try to get ourselves a bigger picture, a fuller picture with all the details of what really is happening in the shelter system. And that includes extension to the winter respite programs, the hotel beds and everything else that comprises the sort of emergency response from the city with respect to homelessness. So it should not be lost on members of council, Madam Speaker, is that this report is full and it's before us largely because members of council have been asking and agitating for it. So we want to thank staff for providing us this information. The date of April 15 weighs very heavily for members in our community in the downtown core. And it's because we are all bracing ourselves for what happens if winter respites are to close and people are to be put out onto the street once again. And you can see, Madam Speaker, is that there are a number of individuals who are living vicariously and they're street involved and they're living in harm's way because they're populated in our streets. We find them in the ravines, we find them in parks, and they need a lot of assistance. So the need to build adequate shelter facilities with the right level of wraparound supports, including mental health and addiction support, is so paramount. And for us, it's a matter of life and death. So the report is timely, but in some ways it's actually a little bit late because we could have done so much better, Madam Speaker, in responding to the crisis that's before us. And I know that there's been conversations about the right language to use. Do we call it a crisis? Do we not? And clearly it is. And by way of the recommendations coming out of CDR, and it was noted by another member of council is that there's all these motions coming out of CDR. These motions are coming out of the CDR because we're actually working together with staff to build a fuller response moving forward every single time. If we did not move those motions at CDR, then what you would have before you is actually the staff recommendations, which actually summarized in as succinctly as I can, says a lot of thank yous to other orders of government. Whether it's thank you for coming to our rescue of the Moss Park Armory, or perhaps thank you for opening up George Free facility, that was certainly not a good enough response. So the motions that have made this now new series of recommendations from CDR is far stronger than it was when we first started the conversation, when CDR first met. What we do know is that homelessness is on the rise. We can ask people to join the list. Get yourself on a housing list, and the wait list for social housing is over 191,000 strong. It will literally be about 7 or 8 years before your name comes up. We know that the supportive housing list is 18,000 strong, and so it's almost a sentence. I don't want to say death, but for some individuals it is almost a death sentence. To be asking them to get onto a list that we will never ever see any progress on if we don't get to the root cause, which is the fact that we have people with mental health that are falling through the cracks. We have entrenched predatory capitalism that forces a land speculation environment around us as the cost of housing becomes more and more expensive, and we have a social safety net that has fallen apart. And as three orders of government are now grappling with this crisis, well, this crisis was manufactured in some ways by the three orders of government, all shrugging their shoulders, deciding not to work together, not building mental health supports, and not adequately responding to what is an economic crisis that people are living in poverty and they're living in harm's way. So that's what this that's what this report is now responding to. It is not the solution, which is what Councillor Cressy is alluding to. We have a lot more work to do, Madam Speaker, but I am glad that we are here now, and I look forward to our next discussion, which is the Ombudsman's report on the winter respite system as a whole. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak to speak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my committee members. It looks like almost all of my committee is going to be speaking today, and I have to give them a lot of credit for the ideas on enhancing and improving our shelter system, for making sure that this conversation continues, making sure that we include it and embed it into our budgetary processes. And I think it's important to also thank our city staff for handling one of the most difficult files that we could hand them. Think for a minute of 6,200 people of our most challenged residents seeking shelter every night. 6,200, a population of most of the towns and cities across this country. And the bottom line is, on the positive side, that the City of Toronto now is sheltering more people, it's saving more lives, and it's providing more supports than any other time in our history. And it is true, it is needed. I have taken the time to visit Seton House, Peter Street, volunteered at Out of the Cold, and of course St. Clair's, and I've listened, I've learned. The need is great, the need is growing, and of course we need our federal and provincial partners to come to the table. As I mentioned earlier, one only need to glance at our division of powers in our federal system to see that immigration is clearly federal jurisdiction, and we need the federal government to come to the table, as they have, as there slowly are, and help pay the cost of those who are on various lists and waiting lists to be categorized in the country. And of course, homelessness is a medical issue, and health care is provincial jurisdiction. Certainly, if we can cure cancer, if we can cure heart disease, then we can practically eliminate the death of homeless people, because those are the leading causes of those who are homeless. So from that point of view, I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to thank once again our city staff for working on this most difficult file, for keeping our homeless safe, for doing everything they can to make sure they come in from shelter from the storm, and of course encourage them to come forward with more reports like this, which are very impressive and provide us for an important framework and roadmap for the years ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councillor Pasternak. Councillor Matlow to speak.
Madam Speaker, it is clear that we need far more affordable housing to support the over 100,000, 150,000 people we know are on the list, never mind the many other thousands of people who are not on the list but are equally as in need. But we definitely need to make sure that we have the supports there and ready to ensure that those who don't have access, who are living on our streets, are cared for until they do get affordable housing, which we're far behind building. We need transitional housing. We need more mental health and addiction support to be able to provide for those people. And ultimately, we need more people on the streets supporting those individuals in need. But I don't just hear about the people who need either affordable housing, transitional, or shelter support. I also hear from homeless kids on our streets whom I've spoken with who have told me that they don't feel safe in our existing shelter system. Who will, I mentioned this the last time we debated this, will go up to Yonge and St. Clair, will go up to other areas of our city to escape neighborhoods where they don't feel safe for their person or their property. So not only do we have to raise the standards of our respites, we also need to raise the standards of our existing shelters to make sure that our kids and everyone who needs to access the support feel safe and are in respectful, caring environments to be able to provide for them while they're in need, while they need a leg up to be able to get the eventual housing that everyone should have a right to. One thing that has not been said today that I believe needs to be said is that over the past several months, there has been a dearth of leadership at the top when it comes to supporting those in need on our streets, our most vulnerable. But I have observed firsthand where that leadership has come from. The first person that comes to mind is Councillor Wong Tam. Councillor Wong Tam at Council, along with people like Councillor Cressy and Councillor Fletcher and others, and Carol, have adamantly been focused on providing for people on our streets who are in need of respite shelter, along with Councillor Bailao, who has consistently championed the end result answer, which is providing enough affordable housing to access for everyone in need across our city. But that's where the political leadership has come from. Councillor Wong Tam told us last year that we would need a respite shelter at the armories. She told us that. She knew that already, and Council ignored her plea. On the ground, people like Kathy Crow When the mayor said, why should we take people like Kathy Crow as gospel? Why should we listen to her? Well, meanwhile, she's being recognized in Ottawa with an Order of Canada as a recipient because of the leadership that she's been providing us. We should be listening to voices like Kathy Crow, who lives and breathes this work, this advocacy. She does know more than we do. And it takes courage and strength to admit when somebody does. When I visited shelters, including Seton, not only did they say, it's nice to see a councillor visiting, but they said, I'm surprised Councillor Wong Tam isn't here because we see her a lot. Because they see the local councillor going to those shelters, not just coming here talking, but genuinely bringing the message, bringing those voices, bringing the voices of people who are never listened to the floor so they can be heard. And unfortunately, when she has brought those voices here, they've been ignored far too long. I want to acknowledge the frontline workers and staff who I know work tirelessly overnight and night after night to support the people who they are entrusted to care for, and I want to acknowledge that, and I express our community's appreciation for the work you do. But this isn't enough. We've started, but this isn't enough. But we need the leadership here to actually listen to voices like Councillor Wong Tam and listen to the voices like Kathy Crow when they tell us months in advance that there is going to be a crisis. We can't pretend that there isn't going to be one when the people on the ground know that there is going to be an emerging crisis. Lastly, I want to acknowledge MP Adam Vaughan. When at the very time that Councillor Wong Tam was asking us to request the armories be open, Adam Vaughan tweeted out, our federal government is here to work with you. If we had got to work right then and negotiated a deal like we did that didn't cost us money, didn't cost us rent anyway, and actually opened up the armories within a good period of time, the armories would have been opened up weeks before they eventually were. Let's trust councillors like Wong Tam and Cressy and others when they bring real voices, real life experiences to the floor.
Thank you, Councillor Matlow. Councillor Baila.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a motion. Thank you. I want to start by thanking the members of the committee by the work that they've done by putting this motion together, working on this issue. When the last time we talked about shelters, I said that I was voting for it with mixed feelings, knowing that we have to strengthen our sheltering system, that we did need to make a huge investment because we're not responding the way that the city should have been responding, but that I feel that every time we are expanding a shelter system, we're failing our city, because we shouldn't be opening more sheltered beds. We should be able to close shelter beds. We should be able to house people properly. That's what we should be doing. And that's why I think this is such important work that we're doing here, because the true and valid way that we're actually going to tackle homelessness in this city is not simply by opening new shelter beds. Yes, we have to have a strong, adequate, humane shelter system, but we need to look at the inputs and outputs, and that's what we're doing in here. It's looking at the transitional housing that we're going to need. How do we deal with the chronic homelessness? How do we deal with those 10% of users that use 60% of the nights, that even though when we put them in housing a few months later, we're going to have them back in a shelter system and they go shelter hopping? Those are the people that we need to help, and the way that we help them is with the supportive housing. And the reason why I'm moving this motion, Madam Speaker, is because there's a list of things that need to be done as part of the motion that came from CDR, a lot of work that needs to be done with the province, for example, and we've had some recent announcements that are actually extremely promising. But there's one thing that I keep hearing from the sector. It's actually how difficult it is to build the supportive housing in this city. And that is within our control. And what I'm trying to do in here is what Councillor Fletcher and I did with the shelter system, is bring the advocates and our staff, our planning staff, and find that middle area where, transitional housing or affordable housing can't be an excuse to build bad buildings and to build, just anything, anywhere. But we also have to understand that building transitional housing it's just not like building any other kind of housing. That there are special needs, and I think we as a city need to have this conversation with the sector and identify what are the issues, what are the solutions, and find that gray area to expedite it and to get it sooner done. And that can be done right here. We don't have to ask the province, and that's what I'm asking right here to be done, is that as part of all this work that we're doing, that we find ways to do it in a more cooperative way with the sector, in the faster way with the sector, and by understanding the sector a little bit better, and the sector understanding what we're dealing with, what the planning principles are, and what they can work with. So that's what I'm adding to the excellent report that is in front of us, that I'm extremely supportive, because like I said, we need to deal with the shelter, but we also need to deal with preventing people from getting there, and then how to move people out. And today, we're dealing with that part, and I think is extremely important work that is being done.
Thank you. Councillor Mammoliti. Well, I know. Councillor Fletcher had her name there, but she took it off. That's why you're next. Councillor Mammoliti to
Madam
speak.
Speaker, I'm going to be repetitive here because I think most people have heard this speech before, but I think every time we talk about these kinds of issues, I think the other side of the equation needs to be mentioned, and this comes from a housing advocate and somebody who believes that we need to be moving faster in this direction. The problem is we've got most of this at our fingertips already, and I just think that the way we're dealing with our emergency shelters and our shelters in general, I think, is the same old, same old, same old. And what do we get out of it? The same old, same old, same old. I think we should be thinking outside the box a little bit more and figuring out how to get these things done sooner. And I'm not one that favors shelters the way we see shelters today. I've said all along that transitional housing is the only way to deal with these kinds of things, and I don't understand why our logic isn't thrown in that particular direction, and instead all we want to do is keep spending money on the current shelter logic that we have today. Treating people like cattle doesn't work. And that seems to be the direction of council regularly. Let's just throw everybody into one room and we're okay. We don't feel guilty anymore. At the end of the day, we can get the same results, probably a little cheaper than what we're doing now, if we were to put some thought into a more progressive way, perhaps, of thinking about that. And the other part to this equation is we still, as a city, refuse to look at what is at our fingertips with landlords that are out there and are prepared to work with the city in housing people, yes, even immediately, if they need it, in units that are sitting vacant in the city of Toronto. We are still refusing to deal with them. And until we I guess, realize that, we're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. Why is it that we don't want to deal with the landlords? What's the reason we don't want to open up some dialogue and some agreements with some of the landlords that are prepared to give us the units immediately in the City of Toronto? I can give you probably 15 or 20 of them that are prepared to work out a deal with the City of Toronto. I know that our staff are prepared to do that. I know that the direction that we've given in this council in the past with policy allows us to do that. The only thing stopping us is a political reluctance to move forward this way. So while I agree with many of the initiatives that we take on with respect to this, I think that politics is standing in our way, and I think that just building on more shelters and throwing money into shelters as we see it and as we've seen it before really doesn't solve the problem. There are ways to deal with this permanently, and I think the politics is stopping us from doing that.
Thank you. Councillor Fletcher to speak.
Thank you, and I do have a motion, Speaker. City Council requests the Deputy City Manager Cluster A to support the development of new spaces for aging homeless by the redevelopment of existing sites, including potential purchases of new sites if necessary. And I will address that specifically I'll address it now actually. There are a number of housing providers that have sites that can't accommodate those who are living there who are aging. And there's many people, very vulnerable people, living currently in nonprofit housing and other housing that simply won't be able to get up and down the stairs, exit and enter the building, move around. And many of these providers are now looking to say, what are we going to do with our long-term clients who simply can't make it in the building any longer? And I think we're going to be having, I don't want to call it a tsunami, but there's going to be greater and greater pressure. And some of them have existing sites that they can't redevelop. They can't redevelop to the point of making a site with an elevator. A lot of the buildings that were built and people moved into many years ago are 4-story walk-ups. Well, when you're broken down in your health, you've had a rough life, and you're at the point where you simply need more help, you cannot go up and down those stairs. Those people are now at risk of moving into the shelters or moving on to the streets. And I think there's just part of our continuum of caring that we're talking about here and that we started out of the winter crisis. Out of the winter crisis, which our Ombudsman will tell us a little bit more about as far as how that was handled and why it became such a big crisis, that we are looking at all of the various issues that we have in front of us. And our staff today said our current capacity is 6,500 people in emergency housing. We need 1,000 more beds. Then on top of that, we have George Street that we have to replace. How many beds was that? 490 beds on top of the 1,000. It's George Street, George Street, Seton House. And then we also heard we have 18,000 people on a waiting list for transitional and supportive housing. And on top of that, we have 181,000 on our wait list for affordable housing. And when we look at the numbers per year that we're able to build, we are so far behind. And when we look at the amount of money that's coming in from levels of government that receive 93 cents on every dollar of taxes paid by residents in the City of Toronto, we see that we have a real problem on our hands. When we're looking at transitional or supportive housing, those aren't 80 beds, those aren't shelter beds, those are rooms. There is First Steps to Home, which Wood Green opened on Queen Street. They took the Edwin Hotel. They got funding that was 50 spaces where people were shoved into broom closets, and they created 25 beautiful little suites for single men to get off the street and get on with their lives. And from what I understand about supportive and transitional housing, you can't have 200 people in a place. They're small, they're boutique, you're offering support to people to develop a new life and move on. So by their very nature, they have to be small enough and micro enough that we can make a difference in those lives. So really, I think that we have a terrible, terrible housing crisis. We have 30,000 people moving in every year to the city. We have 18,000 people who need transitional housing. We have 7,500 people needing emergency housing. We're only able to offer it to 6,500. And we have over 100,000 people waiting for affordable housing. That's affordable rental and RGI in a city that's so wealthy, in a city that's building so much. So when we look at the housing continuum, we can't just look at shelters. I agree with the Deputy City Manager today. We have this in many different places, and we have to actually say, here's our plan from being in a respite, being in an emergency shelter.
Thank you, Councillor Fletcher.
All the way to permanent housing.
Thank you. Councillor Kelly to speak.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, these are my comments on the Ombudsman's report. I have always boasted to others that, sorry. Oh, my apologies.
We're not on that item.
All right, my apologies.
Okay, that's the next item.
Sorry.
Okay. Okay, last speaker, Mayor Tory.
Well, Madam Speaker, thank you. And I just want to just make some comments in summary, in commenting on a report that if we follow what's in here, it really is a roadmap to doing a lot of things to make substantial progress on a problem that I think is not much less severe in nature than just described by Councillor Fletcher in the last couple of minutes. And I just want to comment on 3 or 4 of a multitude of recommendations that are in here, because I think some of them speak to me about the most serious aspects of these problems that have over time been either overlooked or have been attended to in a way that has the less than the efforts of all the governments put together. I think the first thing that these recommendations speak to through the list in different ways is a recognition that is absolutely necessary, and that I continue to push forward to this day, of Toronto's extraordinary needs. When I first got here, members of council will recall, Madam Speaker, that we were in the midst of having the provincial government remove from us $86 million, which actually had to do, didn't really matter what it had to do with in terms of, because money is money, but it had to do with support for housing. They were just taking away from us $86 million. And we then, and I think it was the right thing to do, we had a debate about that here, we amortized that withdrawal of funding over time so that it wouldn't have as severe an impact on our budget. But the bottom line was, it was $86 million out of our pockets that otherwise would have been available. And this goes on and on and on. I mean, so if you look at shelter funding, for example, there was a change made a number of years ago, I don't even remember when, that essentially capped out. No matter what the extraordinary demands were on the City of Toronto to provide shelter for people who needed it, we were capped out on how much money we could get. And I have taken that up with the Premier, I have taken it up with the Minister of Housing, I have taken it up with the Minister of Finance, and I will tell you, I'm actually optimistic. I'm an optimist by nature, but I'm optimistic that when we get to the provincial budget this week, we might see something that actually acknowledges, maybe thanks to this winter's experience, that we have extraordinary needs here, and that they, for once and for all, decide that it's just the right thing to do to recognize that extraordinary need, as the federal government has done, for example, with transit, different kind of issue, but they've based their funding allocation on ridership, which is saying you send the money where it's truly needed. And I will tell you that when Mr. Scheer was here last week, the first thing that I said to him, and I said, look, I am not sitting here as the Mayor of Toronto trying to sort of whine to you or to say that we're special. I am telling you that as you formulate your policy for the federal election next year, please do the homework to understand that this city and its needs are different. They're on a scale that is unlike anything else in the rest of the country, partially because of our difference in provincial policy too, where we actually have responsibility, for example, for social housing, which nobody else in the country does. Secondly, consistent government partnerships. I mean, I think we're in a good place, or a better place now. You know, we've had one government moving into housing as another one moves out. And it's just been an unsatisfactory arrangement when it comes to saying we're all hands on deck on this, we're all in this together. And I think the combination of the federal government's national housing strategy, albeit that the funding is a bit back-end loaded, the province being required to match that, and we being enthusiastic participants in it, give us a reason to be more optimistic that there at least is going to be a sort of 3 out of 3 government partnership with the nonprofit sector and others, and the private sector, to get this done. And I want to just say a word that people often don't expect, but I've tried very hard in carrying out this job to be nonpartisan, because I don't belong to a political party anymore. Peter Milchin, I think, as a former member of this council, brought to his job an understanding of what we face down here, and I think it's shown in a positive way. The stuff he's done reflects what he learned when he was here, and he's taken that to Queen's Park, and I think that's been a very good thing for us. Thirdly, I'll mention what I call the integrated provision of service, and I guess in here there's quite a mention of health. And thank God, finally, before Eric Hoskins left, one of the things he did was to actually introduce the notion that we would have delivery of some healthcare services in shelters. And I think the closer we can start to bring those systems together, and again, that's covered in these recommendations, that's going to be good. And I think this recommendation that's in here about this is very well taken and will serve us well if we can pursue it, as I have been trying to do with both the Ministers of Health and Housing. And then finally, I'll just mention mental health, and I think I've had quite a lot to say about that, and I've said it on our behalf because I believe that there is no more serious problem of mental health and addictions that is driving some of our problems with shelters and capacity for shelters than is the fact that we're expecting people with mental health issues and addiction issues to find the comfort and treatment, more importantly, that they need in shelters where they're not going to find it. We all know that. I mean, the professionals know that, the province knows that, the federal government knows that. And I guess, again, I'll conclude, Madam Speaker, on a note of cautious optimism. You know, last week, the provincial government announced a further investment, I think it was $2.1 billion in mental health. It sort of looked like some of it. I think I remember the number 2,000 supportive housing units, which I thought, if it said 2,000 a month, I would have said, well, that's getting in the right direction. I think it said 2,000 total. But having said that, at least there seems to be a recognition now, and certainly in my discussions with Mr. Milchin, with the Premier and others, I think they get the fact, and that's why we're having this forum on April the 9th, really just to draw more attention to the fact that if we're going to build a city, and if we're going to solve the homelessness problem, and address the overall issue of housing, we must have their support with respect to supportive housing. So I guess all of which is to say there are quite a few things, many things in this report that I think commend themselves to us, and I hope that members will support it as we go forward to do the work we have to do. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Okay, so we're ready to vote. First, we'll vote on the amendment by Councillor Bailao. If we can put that on the screen. All in favor? Recorded? Okay. Yes, I've got yours. Yeah. I won't forget about you, Stephen.
Councillor Kelly, please. Councillor Carmichael Greb.
Councillor Palacio and Councillor Fillion, please.
The amendment carries unanimously, 41 in favor.
Okay, amendment by Councillor Fletcher, recorded vote.
Councillor Ford and Councillor Ticiano, please.
The amendment carries. The vote is 40 to 1.
Okay, so on the item, Councillor, on the item, okay, please, members. Okay, on the item, please. On the item, Councillor Holliday has asked that recommendation 5, 10, and 12 be voted on separately as one vote, and then the rest we can vote on as a package. So on items recommendation 5, 10, and 12, recorded vote.
It's just an extraction of the recommendations.
Councillor Karygiannis, please.
Councillor Crisanti, thank you.
Parts 5, 10, and 12 of the item, as amended, carry 39-3.
Okay. On the balance, as amended, recorded vote.
The balance of the item as amended carries. The vote is 41-1.
Okay, our next item is on page 11, which is the mayor's key item, CC 38.3, the Ombudsman report. It's on page 11. Okay. So did you, as the council's wish that we have a presentation? Yes, please. Council Wong Tam, is that what you wanted? Yes. Okay. Okay. Go ahead.
I'm not sure my
Hold on.
microphone's
Oh. Okay, I think it's on now.
Good afternoon, Madam Speaker and members of Council. I'm pleased to present briefly the report that my office recently completed on the winter respite services this winter season for people experiencing homelessness. As members of Council are aware, winter respite services are different from shelters. They're low-barrier places intended to provide a temporary place for people who are experiencing homelessness to sleep, to have a warm meal, and to obtain referrals for health and housing services. According to the city, they are, quote, designed to engage and provide service to people who with more complex needs who may not otherwise access traditional shelter beds. The background to our inquiry is some work that my office did last year. Last year, there was some public concern about the adequacy of these services. At that time, they were called 24-hour cold weather drop-in services. And we did an inquiry last year looking at the service then. We made 3 recommendations, which are noted on the slide. We recommended that for each site, the city needed to establish a firm, reasonable maximum capacity and put in place protocols for what happens when that capacity is reached. Secondly, we recommended that the city communicate more effectively with the public to respond to concerns that there was not an adequate space for homeless people to get out of the cold. And finally, we recommended that the city collaborate with a research group at St. Michael's Hospital. As part of our work last year, we followed up on implementation of our recommendations, and the city did indeed implement the 3 recommendations. We also pledged to follow the planning for this winter, and we did so. And the Shelter Support and Housing Administration management and staff provided us periodic updates as to their planning for this past season. The plans included extending the season this year so that it would go from mid-November to mid-April. It included opening 5 sites instead of the number of 3 that were open last year, which would increase overall winter respite capacity from 160 to 250. They initiated a new name for these services, Winter Respite Services, and also they made some steps to try to improve communication surrounding the services. As we are all aware, over the holidays, winter struck very hard in Toronto. And there was a extreme cold weather alert by Toronto Public Health, which lasted from December 25th to January the 8th. And during that time period, we will all recall that there were reports in the media about several instances where city staff had apparently given the public wrong information that the winter respite sites were full. And the temperatures were very, very cold, and there was a lot of public discussion and public concern about this situation, and these services generally mounted. So as a result, we determined that we needed to do a new inquiry, and we announced that on January 2nd. We focused on two issues with respect to these services. The first was the question of communication. We wanted to know what happened during those 4 reported phone calls where the city was apparently giving incorrect information to the public. And secondly, more generally, we wanted to assure ourselves on the public's behalf that the city's internal and public-facing communications about these essential services for vulnerable people were adequate. The second area that we looked at related to the conditions at the individual winter respite sites. The city had committed publicly to provide a, quote, warm, welcoming, and safe place for people experiencing homelessness, and we wanted to ensure that it was fulfilling that public commitment. What we did during our inquiry, my staff did a lot of work, I have to say. They interviewed numerous people from city staff to community agency staff at the sites. They interviewed people who use winter respite services. They interviewed many concerned members of the public and many professionals who work with people experiencing homelessness or who work on behalf of those people, and also who work on homelessness policy. They did an extensive review of policies, protocols, the operating agreements for each of the winter respite sites, and various reports on related issues. And then finally, I and/or members of my staff visited 9 winter respite sites. What we found on the first issue of communication was that the communication about winter respite services in the City of Toronto this winter was inadequate. We found that 311 did not have accurate information, and neither did the Central Intake Service, which is a resource for members of the public seeking shelter or respite. We found that at least 3 times, on at least 3 of those calls, on 3 of those 4 calls, staff did wrongly tell the public that there was no space when in fact there was. We found that the terminology the city is using is inconsistent and confusing. We found 12 different terms that the city uses for winter respite services, and you know, we see it in the media, we see it in reports about these services because the language is always changing. We found that the roles of the 3 different departments that give the public information, namely 311 Toronto, SHARC, the Streets to Homes Assessment and Referral Centre, and Central Intake, are not well understood, and even more important, they're not well coordinated. And we found that there were problems with the website. The city's website is not clear enough about what people should do if they are seeking services and what they should do if they are seeking information about the services. On the second issue, the question of site conditions, we found that there was a vast inconsistency in the service provided at different winter respite sites. And at some, we found the conditions were simply below an acceptable standard. Some examples are here. Some had no showers, some had between 1 and 5. Most of the sites had no ramps, elevators, or accessible toilet facilities. None of the sites had beds or cots to accommodate people with mobility challenges. And at one site, we measured the temperature and found that it was as low as 11 degrees Celsius inside. Over the season, as you are well aware, the city expanded the winter respite capacity dramatically and quickly. It went from 239 spaces when the season began on November the 15th to a high of 740, which was the number between January 7th and January 15th. And we have detailed in Appendix B of our report the many openings and closings and changes of capacity that went on through the season as the city attempted to meet the need. The season started out with 5 sites for winter respite and ended up at one point as high as 10 sites. As of this morning, 4 a.m., there are 8 sites operating. There were 660 spaces, and the occupancy was 533 people using those services. This graph in our report presents information, if I may respectfully say so, in a very interesting and compelling way. The gray block is the capacity of winter respite services overall. The green line is the use of winter respite services by date, and the blue line is the temperature. And so what this graph clearly illustrates is that when the city expanded the services, regardless of the temperature, the use increased. Because of the nature of these issues and because of the life and death consequences of services not being adequate, we did something that we don't often do, which is that we made recommendations as we went along. We didn't wait to conclude our work to make all of our recommendations. When we found a problem, we contacted the city immediately to bring it to their attention and to ask them to fix it. So we actually made 9 of those types of recommendations while the inquiry was ongoing. And in each case, the city responded immediately and made the changes necessary to rectify the problem. And those included the things on the screen. When we found that 311's information was wrong, we brought it to the city's attention, they corrected it. We suggested that the public reporting of occupancy and use of the sites needed to be more detailed, needed to be site-specific. They changed that. We brought the unreasonably low temperature that we found in one site to the city's attention, and we recommended that they take steps to immediately make sure that a reasonable minimum temperature was a constant in every site, and that there were going to be ongoing checks to make sure that that continued. Again, the city immediately fixed the temperature in the site in question and implemented a protocol for regular temperature checks at all of the sites. We also recommended that there was an immediate need for some repairs and some housekeeping attention to one of the sites, and as a result, the city developed a ongoing checklist for housekeeping issues, electrical, fire safety, and washroom facilities to be used on an ongoing basis and reported back throughout the season to make sure that the conditions are adequate. In addition to the 9 recommendations that we made as we went along, our report contains 9 further recommendations to address the findings that we made. We recommend that the city require all staff to use simple and consistent terminology. There's no need for all this different language that simply results in confusion and a lack of understanding as to what's being delivered. We recommend that the city clarify the roles of those 3 departments I mentioned, 311 Toronto, Central Intake, and Shark, and that they develop a system for them to work together. We recommend that the city develop a system for sharing up-to-date and accurate information on these important services. We recommend that the data collection be improved. The information that the city collects about who is using these services can be and should be valuable in planning and also in short-term planning, day-to-day, and also in long-term planning of services. And we think that the city needs to make better use of that data. We recommend that the website be reviewed to make sure that it contains the information that people actually need about these services. And perhaps most importantly, we recommended that the city consult with the people using the services, as well as the agencies and professionals working on these services and interested in these in them, on how the quality of the services can be improved. The city, I'm pleased to report, has accepted all of our recommendations, and those that have not been already implemented, it has committed to implementing. There's a quote on the screen from a letter that the general manager of SSHA and the director of 311 jointly wrote to me, expressing appreciation for the role that my office played in highlighting some of these problems, and pledging to accepting the findings, supporting the findings, and pledging to implement the recommendations. Part of the follow-up plan is that for 1 year from now, SSHA will be providing my office with quarterly updates on the implementation of the recommendations, and we will ensure that they are being implemented in the way that they are intended to be. You've talked about the broader context for several hours today, so I won't belabor the issue, but it has to be said, I think, that the causes of homelessness in Toronto are very complex and they're interrelated, and it is a challenge that requires all three levels of government, and we are very pleased to see the city taking the lead in that complicated, difficult, but very important discussion. In the meantime, however, it appears that winter respite services have become, I wouldn't say permanent, nothing's permanent, but a lasting or repeating feature of the city's response to the homelessness problem. And it's clear from the graph that I showed you and from the information we gathered and from this winter's experience that there is a great demand for this type of service, the lower barrier type of service for the people who don't traditionally access shelters. The city, as you have heard, is working on developing minimum standards, which will be different from shelter standards, but minimum standards for these services. And we believe that it's critical that they meaningfully consult, that city staff meaningfully consult with the people who use them, the people who work with those members of society, and also the community agencies that are the city's partners in delivering the services. We want to be sure that all affected stakeholders have a voice in developing the standards. Just before I wrap up, I just want to acknowledge the efforts of some people. City staff and management, with their community partners, it's been said, but I want to repeat it, they worked extremely, extremely hard this winter to provide these services. And all of the expansion of services that I've described, all of the quick response to our recommendations was a lot of work by a lot of people, and I want to acknowledge that. They also provided us excellent cooperation throughout our inquiry, providing the information that we required very quickly and very responsively. As I mentioned, they responded immediately to our interim findings and our interim recommendations and implemented them. And of course, they have pledged to implement the balance of our recommendations. I also want to acknowledge the help of the many other people who provided us with very valuable information, which included people using the services, the staff at winter respite sites, and various professionals and other members of the public who know about these issues and who took the time to help to educate and inform us. Next slide. Oh, sorry, I've just got one more slide. And this is an important one. My team, as members of council may know, is extremely small. We have 5 investigators, grand total of 5. And in order to get this inquiry completed and this report done in the time that we did, you'll remember that we announced this on January 2nd, and we released our report on March the 19th. And what that required was an incredible effort by all the members of the Ombudsman Toronto team. Really, everybody had to put aside everything else that they were working on and dedicate themselves to this task. So I wanted to thank them and commend them for that. Okay. I'm ready for questions, Madam Speaker. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Fragadakis, questions?
Yes, thanks, Madam Speaker. Thanks, Madam Ombudsman. So one area of concern for me is the health supports to those in the shelter system. In item 188, it says here, almost all staff expressed concern about needing better resources to help people find permanent housing and to respond to their critical health needs. They told us that they wanted more supports available on site, social workers and healthcare professionals at set hours to provide the kind of assistance site staff could not. And then item 176 advises that the availability of health and housing support services varied among sites. So in my questions on the previous item, I heard that the LHINs will be piloting 5 programs that could help with this, and I was wondering, did they come up in your discussions?
Certainly, the 2 paragraphs that you referenced from our report, those were needs that were expressed to us primarily by staff at the winter respite sites. In terms of the discussions with the LHINs, my office was not part of those, and I would have to defer to SSHA on that.
Okay.
So through the chair, again, we have an ongoing close working relationship right now with the LHIN. We focused on those 5 pilot locations. We are discussing the winter respite sites with them also.
So is there anything else being done to, and what could be done to address that critical shortcoming? Through the chair to whoever.
Yep. Through the chair. So the healthcare is provincially funded, so we're working with the province and with the LHINs to encourage them to come to the table and assist us with that.
Okay, great. Another item that caught my attention was item 182. There was no clear relationship between temperature and winter respite site usage, even during very cold weather. So can you please elaborate on that and advise if there is any way that an increase in usage might be predicted?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'd be happy to elaborate insofar as we understand it. All I can do is really refer back to the graph that I showed before, which seems to suggest that the more can we put the slide back up? It seems to show quite simply that the more space there is open, the more people will use the service, and it doesn't bear a relationship, certainly in the winter season, to the temperature. What would happen, for example, if the city kept opening services in the warmer months? We don't know.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Wong Tam.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and through you to the Ombudsman. With respect to the recommendations that have now come from CDR, and I know you were here when we were discussing that, do you think those recommendations will also help close the service gaps that we see in the shelter system, between what you've just uncovered in your investigation and also what we know about the system overall?
Through you, Madam Chair, I don't really feel qualified to answer that question because I didn't look at service gaps in the shelter system overall. We really looked at the specific issues mentioned in my report, so I feel I probably shouldn't weigh into that discussion.
Okay. Thank you very much, Madam Ombudsman. That's also very helpful, and I think that's fair. How would you say that contained in your report and now adopted and accepted by staff, do we have enough guarantees that this communication mishap this year, disaster, whatever it is you want to call it, do you think that this will be prevented next year and the years subsequently afterwards?
Through you, Madam Chair, I don't think there are ever any guarantees. I think that the communication shortcomings have been very clearly brought to the city's attention. Even before we made our recommendations, I know that SSHA retained the services of an expert in communications from the Toronto Paramedic Services, who I believe is still working and doing a comprehensive review of all communications related to shelter services generally, both internal to the city and also vis-a-vis the public. So can I guarantee, is there a guarantee? No. Am I hopeful? I am hopeful, but we plan to keep a very close eye on it.
And would you say that when you and your staff were speaking to frontline shelter workers, going through the various sites, talking to central intake, did you get a sense that the staff morale was high? Did they feel like they were trying to overcome a very difficult situation? Was it being coordinated as you saw it? Did you get the sense that they felt confident that even though things were a little bit messy, a little bit clumsy right now, but they were going to get there?
Through you, Madam Chair, is it the central intake staff you're talking about or the on-site staff?
I would say a combination. You went to speak to shelter staff, you spoke to central intake. In your report, you spoke to a wide range of people that manage and handle information and data. Was there clear leadership that was going to guide them to a good outcome?
Through you, Madam Chair, I would say that the problems we identified in our report were problems that many staff we spoke to were keenly aware of, namely that the communication and coordination and sharing of information needs to be better, and also that the availability of services and the conditions and so on are very uneven and in some cases not good enough. Those are things that we heard from staff.
Did staff express to you that this was a new phenomenon, a new occurrence, or was this something that has historically been there? Like, is this something that just emerged this year?
Through you, Madam Chair, these services are relatively new. I mean, I think this is maybe the third year that they have been delivered, and it was on a much greater scale this year than previously. So we didn't hear a lot of it's been like this for years, but we certainly did hear frustration about things, as I mentioned, like communication and the ability to deliver the services in the way that staff would optimally like to.
Thank you. And throughout the shelter crisis this winter, I think that I was hearing some different stakeholders that seemed to punch into the public consciousness. One group was the activists and the service providers, the frontline workers, not necessarily city related, but out there third-party service provider. Another group was the media, and yet another group was the political talking heads, whether it's through press statements or perhaps press announcements. Did you feel at any time that they were all working together, or did you feel like there was a lot of tension that it was because of the advocacy and voice of one group that we would get a political response coming back through another channel?
Through you, Madam Chair, what I would say in response to that question is that there is a real need for everybody. This is a very charged issue. Homelessness is a very charged issue, and people have very strong feelings about it. There's a real need, in my respectful view, for people to remember that they're all should be rowing in the same direction and working on the same outcomes. And where there is disagreement, which there inevitably will be, about exactly how to get there, you know, I think that real listening and real consideration of various voices will lead to the best outcome.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Councillor Wong-Tam. Councillor Fletcher? Oh, wait a minute. There you are.
Thanks. I just have a couple of questions. One was there was a lot of media footage, particularly the Better Living Centre and people going, being turned away. Did you have a chance to review any of that, or did you just rely on interviews with providers?
Well, certainly we considered the media that we became aware of as we went along, yes.
So you did have a chance to review footage, speak to people that had been at the site?
Yes, most certainly.
And one of the things, and I'm not sure how that's discussed here, is there was security on site, there was a third-party provider, and there was the city who was letting people know if there were spots. Am I right to describe it like that?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm not sure about who the security guards worked for or how that was set up, but Mr. Raftis may be able to assist.
Through the chair, that's
Councillor
correct.
Fletcher.
So you weren't aware of there being security guards at Better Living Centre that weren't under the auspices of Fred Victor or the city?
I was not aware of that, no.
And Mr. Raftis, did you let the Ombudsman know about that? No, I guess not.
Well, through the chair, we were certainly open with all the information that available. Whether that specific question came up, I don't recall.
So
but certainly when we,
Madam Chair, I don't believe that we asked about security specifically.
So when people were being turned away, it was security guards turning people away at the Better Living Centre. Is that not correct?
Through you, Madam Deputy Chair, we focused really, in terms of people being turned away, our focus was on those telephone calls that had been reported and on the information that city staff had been giving to the public by phone. So we didn't look at the incidents, the reported incidents of people being turned away at the Better Living Centre in person.
Is there a reason why you didn't look at people that spent all their time to get down to Better Living Centre because they've been told there was a spot and then have been turned away? What would your reason be for not looking at that?
Through you, Madam Deputy Chair, all I can say is I guess it was an oversight. It's just not something that we looked at.
Did you know about it?
Did we know about it?
I'm asking.
Did we know about it?
Were you aware of that? No, I see
We're
that.
not, through you, Madam Deputy Chair, we're not sure whether we whether we knew specifically about that. We knew that there was a concern that wrong information was being given to the public, but whether we were aware of specifically security guards turning people away at the Better Living Centre, I'm not sure.
So the media footage that you had was not of the Better Living Centre and what interactions took place there?
We reviewed a great deal of media. There was a lot of media, as members of council will recall, in all forms about these issues, and we tried to keep on top of it, but I'm not sure exactly what we reviewed.
So I'm just going to ask Mr. Raftis then. Indeed, there was private security or was it private security or security of the exhibition place that was at the Better Living Centre? Which security was that?
Through the chair, there was contract security at the Better Living Centre. There was one incident where a security guard...
Who contracted them is what I'm trying to get at.
That was contracted through the city.
So those were okay?
There was one incident where an individual was turned away by a security guard. That was rectified immediately. That security guard did not return to the Better Living Centre.
That you know of?
Through the chair, no, we know that that security guard did not return to the Better Living Centre.
One incident that you know of. There could have
Through
been
the chair,
others.
that's correct. We were aware of that one incident where a security guard did turn an individual away. That's correct.
One incident you know of. And I just want to ask the Ombudsman, because she very quickly said people really need to work together. Once these discrepancies emerged, it was somehow indicated that there weren't discrepancies. Advice that you gave, because then people said, well, that's not true, which became one of the reasons why you're here. Do you feel your report addresses that and will end that kind of finger pointing that isn't true, even when in the face of media reports and everything else that it was true?
Through you, Madam Deputy Chair, I'm not sure what specifically Councillor Fletcher is referring to where she says that people said that isn't true.
Well, that wasn't that bad or wasn't really
Last
happening
question.
Or it was exaggerated. You didn't cover that either then?
No, I don't think we covered that. I'm not really sure I understand the question. I'm sorry.
I'll have a chat with you after.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Fletcher. Councillor Mihevc, I'm going to have to skip over my name, so I'm putting you up next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in terms of a product, after this process, and maybe you could comment on this and also the general manager, we now have established what we are calling really a relatively new service, Winter Respite Service. And we're going to have a standard for what every winter respite service location will be. And we'll be able to name it. For example, every one of them will have showers, every one of them will have I guess 3 meals, every one of them will be 24/7, that kind of thing. Is that at the end? That's what I think your report is recommending, that we establish a standard. It's different from the shelter standard, and we'll have shelter standards over here, and someone will be able to put on a chart and say, this is the difference between this service and that service.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, and do we have that? That isn't yet, that's in process.
Through the chair, at the moment, there is the development of interim standards. We want to go through an extensive consultation process with the community to make sure that we have excellent consultation before we fully implement those standards.
Great.
In the interim, we have basic standards that we're meeting today.
And the payoff for that is when someone says, oh, the winter respite place, it doesn't offer, you go, well, no, that's our service. If you want that service, you have to go to a shelter.
Through the chair, that's correct. There will be minimum standards. That's not to say that some sites could have even higher standards, but we need to establish a minimum standard.
Okay. The second question is around over bed availability. I mean, a lot of the issues around what people say to folks on the phone who are using or who come to Peter Street is that, and this has been a nut that we have not been able to crack really for 20 years. When we hear deputations at CDNR, we hear there's not enough beds in the system, there's not enough beds in the system. And we haven't been able to find a computer program that aptly organizes 53 independent providers and 10 city providers. Do you think we are in that place now?
I think Mr. Raftis wants to answer the question first. Through you, Madam Deputy Chair, we are not in that place now because one of our key findings was that the information that the people doing intake had was not current and up to date. So no, that type of detailed, up-to-the-minute information is not currently being generated through the existing systems that SSHA has.
So through the chair, two things. So I did ask a communications expert, and when I say communications, communications center expert to come down and look at central intake, Shark, how all those internal and external communications happen. Including in that is the collection of data from a center like that. We're also working closely with the Chief Transformation Officer and the Chief Information Officer to look at the modernization of our shelter management information system that includes mobile collection of data, as well as things like real-time occupancy, the types of things that you're talking about. So that work is underway currently. We do have a dated, unsophisticated, 20-plus-year-old system that really is just not up to the job to manage the type of volume or increase in volume that we've seen in the last 18 months. And I would just like to add that 18 months ago, for the last 10 years, we had relatively straightforward 4,300 beds, 4,300 people being served in the system. Last night we had 6,500 beds and another 600 respite sites, and that's just in the last 18 months.
Yes, so then that leads to the last question, and that is this figure of 90%, because a lot of people hang their hat on the 90%. I can imagine that if you had a very good, up-to-the-minute ability to count who's in what bed, that 90% probably is too, we could probably go a little higher than 90%. Are you looking at, and maybe the Ombudsman might recommend, should we be revisiting the 90%, or is that a number that you feel is still a good number to frankly hold you to account and to hold ourselves to account as needing to provide?
Good question.
So I think it comes back to the question of how do you predict demand, and very, very challenging question to answer. We've added 2,200 beds in the last 18 months into the system, and essentially the percentage has stayed the same, as well as the 600 respite beds into the system, and the percentage has remained the same. So this is a very challenging question to answer. Volume very difficult to predict, but we are doing everything that we can to look at other cities around the world who do this. We have the full support from the executive of the City of Toronto, other divisions, Chief Transformation Officer, to look at these issues to try and get a handle on it.
I think we'd like to know if there's total elasticity or relative elasticity with that number. That would, if you figure that one out, then...
Councillor Mihevc, that was your last question.
Thank you, yeah, appreciate it.
Yes. Councillor Shan is next.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I wanted to ask a question on the slide 11. I don't know if it's SSHA probably. The gray area on that graph, where on the first half of the graph is half of it.
Could you put the graph back up, please? Hello.
So,
thank you.
So my question is basically, if we were double the capacity, we would have had double the usage, technically, or what was a new set of people becoming homeless in January?
Through the chair, that's a very difficult question to answer. So if you look back 2 years, the gray area would be 0. So in terms of predicting demand for this service, very challenging. Last year there were 160 spaces. We came forward in the middle of 2017 with a $6 million plan to increase respite services to make sure that there was enough spaces during the upcoming winter. And as soon as we opened them, they were full, and they continued to fill up throughout that cold weather season.
So during the month of December, I see from this graph that we were at capacity, or at certain points we were over capacity in the shelter system. Was that something that was being communicated? Because there were two types of conversations that were coming. One said, we have the capacity, we don't need it expanded. The other side was saying, so now the graph clearly shows that. So where did we fail in terms of communication around capacities during December?
Through the chair, so the planning is based on historical volumes and need, the data that we had available to us. As we pushed up against those numbers, so at the beginning of December, we moved forward with plans to open new spaces. We opened warming centers and we opened the other locations. So we were doing that based on the continuing demand coming to us in the system.
Now, if we were to extrapolate this chart and say, we do, take the second half, and if we double that, do you think the capacity, that there will be enough demand to fill those two? Because right now we are still going very close to the capacity. So, are we at a saturation level according to you? Are we, because one of the reasons why I'm asking this question is for us to be better prepared to start early with the kind of capacity that is necessary rather than to be reactive, because things seems to be moving a little bit slower for us, right?
Through the chair, I think it's very difficult to predict. We are working with many city divisions, including Office of Emergency Management, to actually implement emergency plans that have not been in place in the past. We're doing a lot of preparation already for next season. 6 months ago, if someone would have said you would have 35% of the volume in your shelter system would be newcomers or refugees, I wouldn't have thought that was the case either. The volume has continued to rise very significantly over the last 18 months. That was not seen in the 10 years previous.
Thank you. Now, my question to the ombudsman's report, ombudsperson, can I get some clarity? Sometimes you find mistakes or errors that are isolated. Sometimes you find some that are prevalent but not systemic, and sometimes you find errors, but that leads to telling you this is systemic. The conditions I'm looking at, the kind of communication errors that have happened, where would you classify as errors, or as something more prevalent, or something that is systemic? Because if it's systemic, it will need a much more penetrated solution to fix it rather than, okay, we'll fix it.
Through you, Madam Deputy Chair, I would call those problems systemic.
Okay. So have you gotten, I heard from you that there were assurances that they have committed to fixing. Are the kind of solutions being put forward to fixing it, looking at systemic factors rather than, we'll tell the staff to do it better? Kind of, that is just entry-level fixing.
Through you, Madam Deputy Chair, we have been assured by city staff that the issues are being, not every recommendation we made dealt with a systemic issue, but certainly some did. And we have been assured that those that are systemic are being addressed accordingly. So, for example, with respect to the communications center expert Mr. Raff just referred to, who is advising the division on better ways of coordinating the flow of information, ensuring that everybody who needs it has it, and so on, those are efforts to address systemic problems in a systemic way.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Shan. Councillor Hart.
Yes, thank you, Deputy Speaker. Just a couple of questions around page 31 and 32 of your report. You mentioned that you went into one of the sites and the temperature was 11 degrees. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And how long had the temperature been low? If it was 11 degrees, it was more than a one-day event. How long?
I had actually been at that site about a week previous, or maybe a little bit less than a week previous, and I noticed that it was much too cold. So we purchased scientific thermometer and arranged to go back, and that's when we took the reading of 11 degrees. So it wasn't a momentary thing.
And was action underway already by staff to have the boiler repaired? I assume it was a boiler issue given that temperature.
Yeah, we were told when we brought the problem to the city's attention, as I recall it, we were told that they thought that problem had been fixed. So I don't know that we were the first people to bring it to their attention, but certainly it needed to be brought to their attention again because it was still 11 degrees.
Okay, and I noticed on page 32 that you say that action will be taken if the temperature falls below 18 degrees. So does that infer that the minimum heat standard would be 18 degrees? The top of page 32.
Those are the terms of the new temperature protocol that the city has put in place, yes.
So 18 degrees is acceptable, if I read that correctly. Is that right?
According to that protocol, I think so. That may be a question for city staff.
I'm just wondering why you wouldn't go with Chapter 629 of the Municipal Code that sets a minimum temperature of 21.
Through the chair, in this specific circumstance, this particular site was being used as a drop-in for approximately 30 years. The staff there had been providing services to homeless individuals for many, many years. The boiler had failed earlier. The operator of the site did have contractors in. We were assured that the boiler had been fixed. Clearly, it had not been fixed. When we were told that it hadn't been fixed, the city responded, put heaters into that specific facility, and then helped the provider to get an appropriate fix to the boiler. The reason why we started with 18 degrees is because, again, some of these locations are long historic locations that have been providing service for many, many, many years. We didn't know what was possible. The goal is to be around 20 or 21 degrees with assistance, but these were interim measures until we can take a look at all of the infrastructure and make sure that services can continue to be provided. The risk benefit is, do you close the site at 18 degrees and have 100 people out of respite, or do you keep them in at 18 degrees and not out at -5 or what have you, with a goal of improving service going forward?
I agree completely. I would keep them in at 18, but I would set the goal at 21, the same expectation that we have for landlords in this city.
Through the chair, understood.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Campbell, questions?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Through to the Ombudsman, was 311 staff ill-informed?
Yes.
Why was that? Were they in it? Should they have been well-informed? Should they have made it their job to be well-informed, or was the job of shelter support to make sure they're informed?
Through you, Madam Speaker, there is a process for city divisions like Shelter Support and Housing to provide information on an ongoing basis to 311 for what it calls its knowledge base. And Shelter Support and Housing had been delayed in providing updated information. They did eventually provide it, but then somehow when the switch over to the new city website took place, that link was missed. That's what we were told.
So was 311 aware that they were giving incomplete information?
Not until we told them.
Not until you told them?
We told them, yes. I told them.
And then what did they do about that?
They fixed it.
They did, okay, all right. So there are a number of misinformation calls that were cited in the report. Not that many, but I suppose it's sort of anecdotal because there's no way to really gauge. But if you were to make an estimate or a guesstimate, how widespread was the misinformation? How frequent was it? How widespread? Can you tell me, your general impression?
Through you, Madam Chair, what gives our work credibility is that we work based on the evidence. So we only looked at 4 calls. We found that in 3 of those 4, the misinformation was in fact there. We would be only speculating to go further to say how many other times such misinformation had been given.
So homeless people, I don't know if they have, cell phones and cell phone plans and so on, because it's kind of expensive if you don't have a roof over your head to have a cell phone. You'd have to use a public phone and find your way to that, and there are not many public phones around anymore. What was the call volume?
First, through you, Madam Chair, I'm just trying to think through how to best answer that question.
I guess I'm trying to understand, because there's a lot of focus in the report on misinformation to callers. So
yes.
People are calling, trying to find out, where can I go to be warm tonight? But I want to know, of all the people seeking shelter, how many people were getting, how many calls were being made, and how much was this perpetuated throughout the system?
Well, many calls are made on behalf of people seeking shelter. So by social workers or other community workers or professionals who are trying to find a place. One of the calls, for example, that we looked at was being made by a volunteer at the overdose prevention site. The site was closing. Somebody there didn't have a place to go that evening, and so she called seeking a winter respite space and was told that there wasn't one.
Right. Okay. But we don't know. We really, in terms of the overall number of people that were accommodated in the shelter system, we don't really have a grasp as to how many people were not given the proper information, do we?
Through you, Madam Chair, I would definitely agree with that.
That's not to say that there wasn't a problem. You've identified a problem. It needs to be addressed, and I know our staff will address the problem. Okay. In terms of, this has been defined as a crisis by some people. I mean, generally, in your observation of this, would you say that those seeking shelter were generally well provided for, or they were not well provided for, or can you make that determination?
Through you, Madam Chair, the people that we spoke to using the services were very grateful for what they were receiving. On the other hand, I think those of us with a permanent home would not feel that they were being provided for in the way that we as a society would want. So, whether you call it a crisis or not a crisis, having thousands of people with no place to call home is really the problem that we're talking about.
Absolutely. But in general, was your general sense of the way that the matter was handled by the city staff, would you say that in general, by and large, people were accommodated to meet their needs in terms of finding shelter?
Through you, Madam Chair, I would say in general, by and large, people were accommodated in their need to get out of the cold. Whether they were accommodated to a standard that the public would expect, those are some of the areas that we felt, we mentioned and spoke to the areas where we felt improvement was needed.
So my last question in the last 6 seconds, did you find that in terms of the quality of accommodation was very inconsistent across the shelters?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, we did.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Carroll?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It kind of works out fortuitously that I had to skip over because my questions follow along with Councillor Campbell's, the concern around 311. Then the reason I ask, I'll give you another context. The reason I ask about 311 is, we're on the verge of also allowing another sort of, could be construed as immediate information need, emergency types of services. There are some police services that we're thinking of sideloading to 311. And so I think it's particularly important at this point to ask if the issue of keeping 311 operators up to date, if that challenge is a real systemic thing, and do you see a need to go back and review it? Were you that troubled by the lack of updating their information?
We were very troubled by the discovery that the information they had about these services was last year's information and it was out of date and it was wrong. But we didn't do a comprehensive review of the state of 311 information generally, so I really couldn't comment beyond that.
Okay. There aren't, in the recommendations, there isn't a real specific 311, just to improve the information to all, to Shark, to the central intake, to 311. Would it be useful for council to look at, asking you to look at the ability to update in real time what information 311 should be disseminating, particularly with respect to sort of human services, such as shelter, such as police inquiries, those sorts of things, given that that's work staff are doing right now?
Through you, Madam Chair, I'm not sure whether it would be useful for council to ask us to do that. I don't know whether there's a problem there. As I say, we really haven't looked at it, so really that's up to council.
Okay.
Through the
Yeah,
chair,
I see
I might
Mr.
just-
Raftis wanted to answer as well.
I might just add that that's exactly what we are going to be doing with the shelter system, but the broader question related to the other communication, we're obviously not looking at that. But our communications expert would include what information would be going to 311 from SSHA.
So you don't need a motion or direction to do that? That's an undertaking you're already on?
No, absolutely. Through the chair, we're absolutely looking at that.
If there are any changes needed, if there's anything you need in order to be better at getting real-time information to 311, would there be a report back coming to a committee such that if there are changes, or would that not happen until a future budget?
Through the chair, we are going to receive a report mid-April. We're going to be working with the Ombudsman's Office quarterly to describe all of the changes that are coming in the coming months.
Okay, thank you. That's good. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak, questions?
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I think Councillor Campbell pre-asked my questions, but I'll try anyway. So, as I understand this, this whole exercise was generated based on 4 phone calls. Is that a fair assumption?
This whole exercise was really a follow-up to our work last year, and the 4 phone calls were a matter of concern. The public's concern that there wasn't enough space and the weather, there were a number of things that led to it. But yes, in terms of the concern about misinformation, there were 4 reported calls.
Now, I know you partially answered it, but on page 20, item 129, the 4 calls illustrate serious shortcomings in the city's intake and referral system for winter respite services. Do you think that's a statistically significant enough number to warrant those kind of comments?
Through you, Madam Chair, what we said is that they illustrate the problem. They don't establish the problems. The shortcomings are what we discovered when we gathered extensive information by speaking to people at 311, at Shark, and at Central Intake, and the information we learned about how little coordination there was among them and how little common understanding there was about the role of each one. Those were the shortcomings we were referred to, but the 4 calls were just 4 examples of what we found to be a larger systemic problem.
Right, but you've made some pretty sweeping comments here. You call the respite sites were overwhelmingly outdated, inaccurate, and inconsistent. I guess that's the information.
Yes.
Based on those calls.
Well, based on the fact that 311 Toronto, which is the city's major information hub, based on the fact that it had information from last year that was wrong. They had records of 3 winter respite sites when in fact there were 5 and they were different. We felt that that was really unacceptable.
So when I started reading this, I thought we were going to get a report on how to manage intake, how you take calls in and then measure load factors among our various respite locations, and make sure that we send people accurately and correctly to places that have capacity. That's what I thought I was reading. But then you sort of start morphing into service levels and get into accessibility, all important issues, beds and showers, and other kinds of, I guess, service levels. Don't you think it's turned into a bit of a mishmash here? Are you trying to fix our communication system, or are you trying to rewrite service levels for respite services?
Through you, Madam Chair, the Ombudsman's Office doesn't do the work of the city. We don't fix things. What we do is that we review services, and where we find problems, we identify them, and we try to make constructive recommendations to address them. So we started out looking primarily at communication. We then soon learned from our discussions with many, many people that there was a concern about inconsistency and inadequate service levels in the sites, so we expanded our inquiry to include that.
So let me give you a scenario of a location with 10 empty spaces. And we want to send people there. how do we know how many people are already en route? How many people more can we refer? And whether, in fact, we're sending too many people to that site where we don't have the spaces really available?
Through you, Madam Chair, currently we don't know that.
We don't know. Did you visit Peter Street? I don't.
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, I did.
I didn't see it on the. Maybe I missed it.
I visited it last year.
Oh, last year.
And I think my staff visited it this year, and I think it is in here. It's not considered a respite site, but we gathered information there, and we did visit and speak to staff. It starts at page 16 of the report.
Right. It has a 24-hour drop-in.
It has a 24, it has, through you, Madam Chair, you're correct, it has 24-hour drop-in services, but it's not considered a winter respite site by the city, because it's open all year. Is that right?
Final question. Now, you've gone to staff before coming to council, and staff have agreed to invoke these or implement these recommendations, which I think is fine. But doesn't the Ombudsman report to council, and do you think it's appropriate that staff have agreed and adopted these recommendations without or prior to council approval?
That's it, Councillor Pasternak.
Through you, Madam Chair, as I mentioned, the making of recommendations immediately as we went along was unusual for this in this case. But in general, as a matter of procedural fairness, it is our practice once we have provisional provisional findings and recommendations to share them with city staff to make sure that we haven't gotten something wrong, and to take their representations on what we are proposing to find and recommend. So, of course, Councillor Pasternak is correct. The Ombudsman reports to Council, but part of our process is to share our findings and recommendations in draft with staff before we bring our reports forward.
Thank you. Councillor Holliday.
Thank you, Speaker. Through you to the Ombudsman, thank you for your report. My eyes were drawn to, in particular, paragraph 178 on page 26. It's the last one, and it talks a little bit about storage at winter respite sites. The line that drew my attention was one that said that some people were allowed to leave items on site at their sleep space if they were returning that night, but others required people to take their belongings with them if they were stepping out for more than a moment. And I'm intrigued to learn a little bit about your findings in more detail about how this worked. I take it the standards were different at the different sites, or maybe it's not standards but house rules. And how does that work with respect to the counts of the numbers of people who were there? Were there cases where people had left their belongings and they were counted as being there, or were they not counted as being there? How could we be sure that we were accurately understood at any given time how many people were using the respite site?
Through you, Madam Chair, what the information we were given was that the counts are done at 4 a.m., just as they are in the traditional shelter system, and they're based on the number of human beings there, number of heads, not based on who may have left some belongings there.
So a count at 4 a.m., so that's what is used to inform people, say, looking for a respite site at, say, 6 p.m. the following day. So how on earth would we know if there was room in those places?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think Councillor Holliday has put his finger on a very important point, which is one of the key differences between a winter respite site and a shelter is that there is no curfew at a winter respite site, and people can and do come and go. So the 4 a.m. count is probably not the best way of assessing the usage of a winter respite site, and that's why we've recommended that the city look at figuring out a better way.
So we talked a lot about standards in the previous council item, but would you be able to comment, is there a difference between, say, shelter or winter respite site standards versus something more like house rules about what you can and cannot do as a user of that program? I don't know, a simple rule might be no smoking inside. Or you can leave your belongings if you step out for a few hours versus somebody else that says, I'm sorry, you can't leave anything here. You drop in, you stay, maybe you step out for a quick moment, but you've got to take your things when you go. And lastly, how does the interface of those two concepts relate to the idea of low barrier? And the way I read low barrier is reducing the number of rules so that we welcome more and more people to come and use these services.
Through you, Madam Chair, when we talked about minimum standards, we aren't really talking about house rules. We're talking about making sure that the service being provided to people using the services is reasonably consistent from one site to the next. So it's a matter of things like temperature, like housekeeping, like how many showers there would be per number of users, access to services, healthcare services and or housing support services, things like that.
Did you have any findings with your interviews with people with respect to how they felt about house rules or other barriers that might be in place to entice them to come and use the shelter, the respite site?
Through you, Madam Chair, we did hear a lot, both from people using the services and from staff, about the fact that the rules and restrictions that are present in shelters are very difficult for some people to obey and to abide by. Simple examples are, a simple example is a pet. If somebody has a pet, they can't use a traditional shelter currently, but they can use a winter respite site. For some people, that is a very, very significant difference.
So over to the General Manager, I just wanted to know, in the winter, in January, what were the places that we opened up following, the Armory and the Better Living Center? I'd heard something about a gymnasium somewhere near Yonge and Wellesley, and how many people used those places as they were successfully opened over time?
Through the chair, so on November 15th, we opened up the 5 winter respite sites. December 21st, we opened up the Better Living Center. January 4th, we opened up 2 warming centers because of how cold it was, Metro Hall and Regent Park Community Center as warming centers. On January 6th, we opened up Moss Park Armory. On January 27th, we opened up Davenport and then subsequently closed the Moss Park Armory. And on January 28th, we opened up 354 George Street, and we also closed the warming center at Regent Park. During extreme cold weather alerts, we continued to have Metro Hall opened as a warming center throughout the winter season.
Thank you. Councillor McMahon.
Thank you very much. I would just wanted ask a couple questions on kind of procedure and the whole investigation. So, through you, Madam Speaker, how many staff did you say? 5 you had working on this?
Through you, Madam Chair, we have a total of 5 investigators in the office, and I believe at least, I think 4 of them worked on this.
Okay. And how many hours you said from, was it the end of January to mid-March?
It was beginning of January to mid-March, and it was a pretty much full-time undertaking for those 4.
So they couldn't work on anything else because they were focused on doing this project?
Pretty much, yes.
Okay. And interviews and looking at media footage and all kinds of other things for the investigation?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, that's right.
And you feel that your office did a thorough and meticulous job on this report?
Through you, Madam Chair, I feel that we did, and certainly that was our goal.
And you're proud of it?
Yes.
And your team? And so just with regards to the questions before about the security guard incident, one, to our knowledge, what do you feel as far as the role of STRATCOM in that situation, as far as getting the proper information out? Were they involved? Should they have been involved?
Through you, Madam Chair, I think there were communication challenges, and the city had various options on how to address them. I really couldn't comment beyond that.
Okay. All right. But from your standpoint and your team, you did a very thorough analysis and investigation of this, hence the amazing report, and you stand proud of that.
Through you, Madam Chair, and yes, we did what we could in a short time period. We tried to be thorough and exhaustive, but of course, we can't look at every single aspect of an issue, and we certainly can't do it in this kind of a time frame.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor de Beermaker.
Thank you, through you, Madam Speaker. Madam Ombudsman, thank you very much for the report. I greatly appreciate it. Some of my questions, I'm going to get into details later perhaps, but you started your investigation or your inquiry, because was it your feeling or was it a report to you that there was inadequate space at our shelters?
Through you, Madam Chair, it really wasn't either of those. It was a matter of the public concern, the reports about communication breakdowns, but not specifically inadequate space.
Okay, so your inquiry is, and again, in your two areas of focus were communications and conditions within our shelter system.
Within the winter respite system, specifically.
Winter respite system.
Yes.
One of the 12 names.
Yes, but they are different from shelters.
Yes.
Yes.
But your inquiry and your conclusions don't address what is an adequate number of respite centers versus shelters versus assisted housing levels.
Through you, Madam Chair, that's correct. They don't.
So you were really looking at the clarity of how we communicated to members of the public, like you or I, if one of our family members needed some help. You wanted to make sure there was a clarity, and in terms of when your family member or my family member ended up at a respite center, I'll call it for now, that there was some consistency.
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, that's right.
Okay. And in terms of the clarity, I think, and I can't remember specifically, I think there were 12, I think in your inquiry said there were 12 different adjectives or labels or names given to our respite centers. And would it surprise you to know that when I sent out an email blast to about 4,000 people in my ward, I didn't actually call our respite center a respite center. I called it a homeless shelter because that's what I felt people in my Scarborough Centre ward would actually understand. So have you come to a conclusion as to what the city should call our respite centers, or what of the 12 adjectives or 12 names, what the appropriate name should be? And I don't know if our senior staff have thoughts on that as well, but you know there's lots of different names that mean different things to different people. So what is your advice to us?
Through you, Madam Chair, our advice is that a term needs to be selected for these services, which are different from shelters, and then it needs to be used consistently. We didn't make any recommendation as to what the term should be, but it's important for people, particularly people who are referring someone to the service or who are using the service, to know what type of service it is, and we found that the language was just too loose, and so therefore there was a lot of confusion in the media, in the public, among service providers, etc. Even within the people doing intake and referral, they weren't always clear on what was a winter respite site, what was a warming center, what was a shelter, so we just think that needs to be tightened up and clarified.
And thank you. Through you, Madam Speaker, maybe I could ask our senior staff, have they landed on one word or one label or description?
Through the chair, we're actually going to start completely fresh and create a lexicon of standardized language for the organization and actually have that printed and available for everyone. You know, I mean, if you looked in sort of a medical dictionary, if you will, you have all kinds of people who would call something a heart attack, or, you know, say, you use another word for that, but there's actual standardized language, and so we're going to create that lexicon and make sure it's available to everyone.
And through you, Madam Chair, I'm assuming that you would understand to our senior staff that the language that's good for a medically trained doctor is probably not good for somebody like myself, who doesn't know what all the technical terms of a heart attack is.
Through the chair, that's correct. And so we're going to include that in our consultation process with the community and get some feedback on that language before we finalize it.
Right. And through you, Madam Chair, to our senior staff, then, when I sent my email to my residents trying to help them, I was using incorrect language. I should not have said, there's a homeless shelter in our local community. That was the wrong language.
Through the chair, that's correct.
Okay, through Madam Speaker, and maybe to the Ombudsman, part of your report focuses on sometimes spaces being available, but people told spaces were not available. So I would say, is the goal of your report to help us as a council make sure that if we are paying for and operating shelter spaces that are available to our family and friends, that we make sure people can actually use them and not be turned away when there are spaces available for them?
That was your last question?
Through you, Madam Chair, yes, absolutely.
Thank you. Councillor Ainsley?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just have a couple of questions for staff. I read in the report about the Ombudsman sent thermometers to the shelter to measure temperature.
Through the chair, that's correct.
And I was just wondering why we're not using, so there's, for example, in New York City, they have an organization called HeatSeek NYC that uses secure remote sensors that they put in New York City, they use them for apartments to measure temperatures, and the information gets sent over the internet to a secure server. They're pretty inexpensive. Just wondering why we're not doing anything like that in the shelters and respite centers or out of the cold programs.
Through the chair, so it's a great modernization strategy and one that we would definitely consider. We purchased handheld temperature monitors for staff at the centers.
Okay, and then the other question, based on we've had the discussions, I passed a motion in January just to see where we are with providing informations on the shelters and respite centers in an open data format.
Yep. Through the chair, so we're actively working on that with the CIO's office, who's responsible for open data. There is a privacy process that we're going through currently because of the nature of that particular information, the gathering of that particular information, and our target is for, as I had mentioned, May. So we're focused on trying to get that out at some point in May.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Davis, questions?
Thank you. To the General Manager, when did we begin 24-hour warming centers?
Through the chair, my understanding is 2015.
Right, so these are new as well. We had daytime ones, but then we created overnight.
Through the chair, my understanding of the history is there is drop-in centers at a number of these sites for 30 plus years, and the request was to turn them into 24-hour sites in 2015.
And then these winter respite services were created when?
So through the chair, there was an additional overnight site that was created in 2016 at a community center, 12 hours only, for a couple of months. Really, the planning for having 5 sites available started last July.
And they became 24-hour as well.
Through the chair, that's
so
correct.
We have 2 very similar services that are not shelters.
Through the chair, that's correct.
And they both are low barrier.
That's correct.
So in some way you're going to harmonize the low barrier temporary respite warming centers, drop-in centers into something that has some consistent standards for all of these types of services.
Through the chair, for the 24-hour services, that is correct.
My worry is that then we're institutionalizing some other sort of lower standard form of shelters. And I'm wondering why we would not simply, and I know we're trying to expand shelters, and I worry about expanding shelters and not housing. Are we not then institutionalizing really new forms of substandard housing?
Through the chair, I think the challenge is you have a couple of distinct populations of individuals to serve, and the existing shelter system, independent of respite sites, many people will not go to the existing shelter system.
Right.
So the respite sites are designed in a low barrier way to attract individuals to come in out of the cold, get them off the street, who would not generally go to shelters.
So I know, having in the last ice storm actually attempted to find housing for a woman with a pet, with a dog, that she was not going to go anywhere, that the dog wouldn't go. And I'm wondering, I know that pets are a huge issue, and I'm wondering whether or not it has forced you to relook at the question of pets in shelters in order to ensure higher, at least a slightly higher standard emergency housing for people with pets. Have you identified pets as a significant barrier?
Through the chair, it is a very significant barrier. In our 5 new sites with the new model that we are piloting, we are including pets within that to capture that population. But pets is only one issue. There are, very significant mental health issues, addiction issues, a number of different things, reasons for why individuals wouldn't access the emergency shelter system. It wouldn't exclusively be pets.
So in the respite centers and the warming centers, you have people who have even greater challenges or have faced greater barriers, and maybe even in greater need for support services. So is your intent to provide more of those kinds of services, or at least to work with other service providers to provide those other services?
Through the chair, I would call them different, not necessarily greater, because some individuals within the shelter system have very significant needs. I would call them different, and the answer is yes. One of the reasons why we're having the dialogue with the LHIN is to focus on those wraparound health supports, not only in the emergency shelter system, but elsewhere in the system also.
And we have 5 LHINs. Are we working with all 5 LHINs?
Thank you.
Through the chair, yes.
Thank you. Speakers, Councillor Mihevik.
Thank you. I rise only to just basically say thanks to the Ombudsman for her good report. I think it was wonderful that she entered, and her office entered the conversation over the winter time, and I think she's providing some very, very good advice that staff are obviously taking into consideration or following up on, and have agreed to all of them. It's good that her office was in on this conversation. Council has been around the block a few times through the budget process and elsewhere through the conversation. And I know staff in our shelter, housing, and support division have also been through the ringer a number of times and deserve a lot of praise and high regard. Madam Speaker, I think for me, having been on community development for many years in my political career, what we witnessed this last year, when you think about it, basically a more than 50% expansion of our shelter system. We really were running this last year, and it comes as a result of a whole bunch of external factors that were beyond our control, some within our control as well, of course. But I honestly feel at this point, it seems that we have the right pieces in place to make some major advances in stabilizing the system as a system. Now, the problem, of course, is that Toronto has become an even more expensive city even as we speak. And I think that's probably going to push these numbers, or possibly push these numbers even beyond the beyond. And of course, we don't want to just stay with the shelter system. We want to start to focus attention on the housing, and particularly the supportive housing system, and eventually look forward to the day of actually closing shelters because we've housed people appropriately. But Madam Speaker, I think for today, I honor the work that the Ombudsman has done. I thank staff within our division for taking the issue seriously, and to all of us, I think this is an area of work that for the longest time we hadn't paid enough attention to. But I think this last year, all of Council paid good attention to it, and I think it has yielded some good results. Yes, there's some big budget items that have come with this, but it is in a way better place this year than it was last year, and that's because I think this City Hall took the issue seriously, the weather helped, and we're in a better place for it. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. That's it.
Thank you. Councillor de Beermaker to speak.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and like Councillor Mihevc before me, I do want to thank both the Ombudsman and her staff and our senior staff that are still here from our housing and shelter support for doing remarkable work. I think our goal, and I think this council as well, wants to do good things for the people, our own family members, and for the people that we love, the people we live next to, and the people that we want to help within the City of Toronto. Certainly, as I sort of realized, I think, when I sent out my email blast to people, I was very proud this year to have a new respite center open in my ward. I didn't call it a respite center, and I suppose if anyone of the 68,000 people who live in my ward should have known the correct term to use, it should have been me. But I didn't call it a respite center because I didn't quite know what a respite center was myself, and I have a master's degree from the University of Toronto, so I don't think it's not because I'm well educated or don't understand things, and I've been in this building for 14 years, but I certainly knew that most of my residents and many of my neighbors who are newer Canadians, if I said there's a respite center down the street, they would look at me and they wouldn't quite know what to do, and that's if I was there to talk to them. To put that out in an email or a flyer or a communication blast or on a website, I took it upon myself to call it a homeless shelter, because even though that's not the right, I'll call it medical term, it is a term that my residents could understand, and I knew it was an imperfect term, and I think that's something our staff will have to deal with. And I think acting in faith, everyone's going to end up in a spot that may not be perfect, maybe not what a medical doctor would describe the service as, but it allows the residents that I represent to actually understand that for the first time in Scarborough, there is a place that they could send their family members, their friends, members of their congregation or their mosque or their temple to go to and to get help. And I'm very glad that we've got that shelter there. It was done, I have to say, very quickly, and there's been a learning curve, and nobody likes mistakes being made, but I have to say, even with the mistakes, even with the blemishes or the pimples, I'm very glad it's there as opposed to not being there. I'm very glad the Ombudsman, as in all of her reports and her predecessors' reports, has actually come to us as a council to say, you're providing a service to your residents, a vital and good service to your residents. Here's how you can make it better. And I'm glad our senior staff didn't try to push back or say, well, it was the media were wrong, or well, it was one security guard who made a mistake, and by the time that person walked down the driveway, one of our staff ran down the driveway and got them back in, so there's really no problems here. I think that in identifying ways to improve, perhaps people would call them problems, but the challenges and issues that we're facing is a reality that we are increasing and wrapping up the system to help thousands and thousands of people get last-minute emergency shelter that should be getting better support and better services from the City of Toronto. So I would think that as we move forward, if there are in Scarborough or at the Better Living Centre, if there are, I think at one point December the 30th, if there are 30 available spaces or 20 available spaces or even one available space out in a shelter in Scarborough, that if you're that person or you're the brother or sister or father or mother of that person who needs that emergency help, that you'll want to know that that one spot is open to help that person that needs to be helped. Certainly I know in my shelter again, there's one example where the police officers took somebody to the shelter, dropped them off at the front door, drove away, person went into the shelter and they said, sorry, the inn is full, you can't be here, and that person just hung outside. That's what they did. Maybe some people would describe them as they tried to break into other buildings to maybe get warm. But they did things that caused some anxiety for people and other businesses that were operating in that area. But we have to make sure that we have a system that when there's space available for people, they can get it. And when the shelter is full and somebody pulls up, whether they're being dropped off by a police vehicle or by a local church van or an outreach worker or a taxi, or they walk in off the street, that we're able to shuffle them over to another shelter. So, Madam Speaker, I want to thank our staff, our ombudsman. This is a very good report. It will help us take care of the people we love in the city. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor de Bermick. Councillor Kelly?
Thank you, Speaker. These are my comments on the Ombudsman's report. I boast to everyone about the caliber of the staff that we have at City Hall. And frankly, after reading the Ombudsman's report, I was quite taken aback. A siloed system instead of one that's integrated and focused. An archaic system that used everyday technology and cell phones instead of computers. Apparently inadequate training and sloppy maintenance. I would hope that not only in this department, but maybe others as well, that this report by the Ombudsman will constitute a wake-up call.
No, apparently that's why they said.
Speaker,
They said.
we have competent managers. We have an IT department. We have the intent of building a system that works. And I would hope that, and I know that the department has said we recognize what's going on and we will make the changes. And the only advice I can give them as they move in that direction is to be mindful of the KISS principle. Keep it simple. And I would hope that, say, a year from now or so, if the Auditor General reviews that department, that all the deficiencies would have been identified and rectified, and that we will have a system that we will be very much proud of, Speaker. Those are my thoughts, Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Ainslie to speak.
Thanks, Madam Speaker. I did have a motion. I'm not sure if it's ready. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I have a motion that City Council requests staff to examine the use and implementation of secure remote sensors that measure temperature and upload data to the city, similar to what HeatSeek NYC uses. So what this mentions, and one of the things that stood out for me in the report, was the Ombudsman bringing thermometers to the respite centers to measure the temperature in the building. That kind of surprised me. There's a program, I used it as an example at the last executive committee meeting. It's called HeatSeek NYC. They have a secure device that's installed in an apartment. It measures temperature. It's done wirelessly over the internet. It goes to a server. It keeps track of it so that people know what the temperature in a building or an apartment is compared to the outside. I think that staff can use that in the same way in the 21st century in respite centers. Homeless shelters are out of the cold program and not looking at a thermometer on the wall, which can break in any number of different ways. I do want to thank the Ombudsman for a very comprehensive report. I want to thank for the staff that were here today to look at this. You know, we have our homeless shelters, our respite centers that are a different type of capacity or service than our homeless shelters. I think they're very much needed. The other question I have with staff is around open data. in December and January. I spent a lot of time on social media. I heard a lot of comments from a variety of different areas across the city, even some people using the shelter system, the concerns they had in gaining access, knowing where to go to the respite center, what the capacity was. I think using open data will also go a long way to solving the issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Pasternak to speak.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm going to be very brief. I just wanted to thank the Ombudsman and her team for the work they've done on this report. It's very rare that I read one of the Ombudsman's report twice, but in fact I did, and you can tell by all my highlighters and post-it notes that I found much of it interesting. Well, I think it's still a little unfair that this was triggered by 4 phone calls. I think it's important that we fix the problems that have been identified. The last thing the homeless need or their caseworkers need is anxiety and stress and trying to find them a place where they can be safe, where they can be out of the cold, and where they can spend the night. We have to reduce the anxiety. We have to ensure that we run these operations as professional organizations, and we have to be sure that we're consistent with our terminology. Nothing can confuse people more than terminology where people are using different phrases and namesakes for the exact same thing and wondering whether in fact it applies or it doesn't apply. So I think the Ombudsman's report of this year and last year, combined with the work of CDR and the motions that are coming forward, provide our city staff with an enormous volume of direction on policy, on framework, on where we want to go with this. And I think if you combine it all, if you bring it all together, you've got a pretty strong reformed shelter system. And then we have to, phase 2 is to bring the other levels of government to the table to make it all work. Because looking ahead, it doesn't seem to me the homelessness situation is going to go away anytime soon. We must make sure that people are safe as homeless, but we must also continue not to lose sight of the fact that we have to work on the preventative side and the solution side as well. So once again, I thank the Ombudsman and her team for this conversation, and the Mayor for making this one of his key items. I think it is vital as city building because many cities are judged on how they treat their homeless. And I think it provides an important document for future policy making and reform. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Councillor Wong-Tam.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I too would like to echo my gratitude to the Ombudsman and her dedicated team of investigators for compiling this report, going out in the middle of winter to in the middle of sort of this communications storm to try to find clarity in an area that seemed to be befogging most individuals. This has been a very frustrating winter. It's been a frustrating winter for those who are homeless and street involved, and for those who are working really hard to provide supports for the most vulnerable in our city. And I know that although the Ombudsman took it upon herself to initiate this investigation, I think it should also be noted, Madam Speaker, that there was a large civil society outcry between those who were advocates trying to raise the alarm bell, as well as journalists, some of them in the press chambers here today, that this was a brewing crisis. And so I want to just remind us, Madam Speaker, that the backdrop to this report is not necessarily just the fact that there was a communication breakdown that led us to the findings and the 18 recommendations from the Ombudsman, but it was also the fact that there was a wall of resistance, some of it at the staff level, some of it at the political level, that refused to take a look at the crisis before us. And so the work that we had to do to break down those silos that is now manifesting in recommendations from the Ombudsman goes far beyond just the investigation. We had to have a coming to terms and a coming to the truth moment where the political leadership had to rethink what was happening and think about what a proper response would be to a crisis that was not named, although some of us were naming it. And I think it's very important, Madam Speaker, to note that throughout the winter there was massive confusion just about everywhere. Central Intake didn't know what SSHA was setting up in terms of new direction and services. They did not communicate that information, or at least that information was not received at the frontline service providers. We also have a system that was simply not responding and not being updated clearly and fast enough. We had people calling 311 because they were told to call 311, that perhaps there could have been a diversion of calls that could have gone to 211, and so forth and so forth. To be able to untangle all of that, Madam Speaker, requires dedication and focus and discipline moving forward. It also requires us, Madam Speaker, acknowledging mistakes when they're made, and knowing that when political interference takes place, when we start to make excuses on why things are happening, and we start to assign blame to other people, such as lazy journalists or perhaps activists that were misrepresenting the truth, that's not fair. That's not contained in the Ombudsman's report, but certainly all of that was in the background and the backdrop of the Ombudsman's report, although not covered. And I just want to thank those individuals out there who kept our feet to the fire, including mine, because there were times where I actually said, "Are you sure? Is that really truly the situation that's out in the community? I am not sure if I see that." And they said, "Councillor Wong Tam, you need to listen to those with lived experiences, and you need to get your colleagues here on City Council to also pay attention to the fact that the system is broken and it needs to be rebuilt, and you need to stop being so defensive when we tell you that things are not working." That was the lesson that I certainly learned 3 years ago when I was in the same position as some members of council saying, we have enough that's out there, services are being delivered, communication is clear, and perhaps you're just not getting it. I've now learned my lesson. I don't want us to have to go through this ever again. And it's so critically important that when we bring people with the lived experience who are delivering the frontline service to the table to listen to what they have to say, there's a very good chance that we will not make this mistake again. And I would hate to think that we will not have learned this. So therefore, I want to thank the Ombudsman, because not only should this report set us on the right path to fix the miscommunication, but hopefully that it will be done in a permanent fashion where we never have to face this crisis again. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to the last speaker, is there anybody else that would like to speak on this item? Okay, Mayor Tory, last speaker.
Well, Madam Speaker, thank you. I'll speak very briefly, and just to say that I think it is a good thing for all of us, including myself and everybody else here, to say what Councillor Wong Tam just said, because I too have learned some lessons from this, and I don't want that to be written up in the wrong way. I mean, every day we learn about these issues. We learn from various places and from various people, but I want to say that the learning I took in this instance was not only for my own personal observations, and I was out a lot this winter to the shelters and the winter respite centres, and of course, we went through a very difficult issue. By difficult, I don't make any reference to the kind of division that was in here and elsewhere in the media and so on, but rather a difficult issue because there clearly were people who were not being served by us in the way that they would have the right to expect. And I want to thank the Ombudsman for writing this report in the way that I would also expect from her, because I've known her for some time, and that is a way that is thoughtful and constructive and straightforward, but wasn't trying to sort of make a particular point other than to try to make the points that needed to be made, if you know what I mean. And I appreciate that very much. And your staff, because you, as you said earlier, it's not a big group, and you dedicated a lot of resources to this, and I actually saw you in action when I was out in some of the shelters as you were. I think the other thing that's really important to note about this is whether it's from me, whether it's from, I think, the others involved on City Council, and whether it's, and most importantly, perhaps from the staff, that the response to the Ombudsman's report was very straightforward. We accept unreservedly all of the recommendations. Now, that puts a challenge in front of us, obviously, in terms of making sure we can implement those, and it's a reasonably tall order. These things sound easy when you read them, or when you read them out to yourself, or when you say you're going to accept them, but it's a very complicated issue. Even if a standard's very clear in black and white, it's another thing entirely to actually implement it when you're actually in the process of so doing. But having said that, I think starting with Mr. Raftis, and I want to say, and his staff, who I will tell you, Madam Speaker, that whatever the controversy would have been, I will stand here happily and proudly and say this, because there's no one who spent more time with them than I did. There are people who spent as much. Their heart was in the right place all the way through this, as we were going through some times when we were not meeting the public's expectations, and the work they did do to try and catch up when we fell behind was remarkable. So notwithstanding what the report says and the fact that I think we all accept the recommendations, I want to just say to them that I appreciate their efforts, and I really appreciate the fact that they started to implement. This is what often doesn't happen in government or elsewhere, which is you wait around for the report and then you take a whole bunch of time to actually begin implementing. They started, as the Ombudsman herself acknowledged earlier on, to implement these recommendations as soon as they knew they were coming. And so it means we're sort of, I think, getting well advanced. And someone asked the question earlier on, I think it might have been Councillor Fletcher, can you kind of guarantee that nobody's going to call up next winter and get misinformation? Well, of course not. The Ombudsman, I think, said the same thing. You can't guarantee anything, but I think we're going to be much further ahead in terms of knowing that that was an unacceptable state of affairs and that it's going to be improved. The same with the standards. I think the commitment we've made, that based on this recommendation, to develop a standard that is modeled on the shelter standard but is different, recognizing the fact some of these resources are different in nature, is a step forward. Because my staff would tell you, I came back and I talked to Mr. Raftis and others, and I wasn't happy with, I was glad that people had a place to go, but a place to go is not the standard we would want to have as the standard in the City of Toronto, and I know we can do better than that, and that's part of the commitment of accepting all of the recommendations, is that we do better at having a consistent standard for next year. And so I just want to say thank you to the Ombudsman, thank you to the City staff, and thank you to the members of Council, because I think we're in a better place now as well, where, while this will still be a difficult issue, and I just plead with people not to make it a polarizing issue. I don't think there's a person in this room, I will say, not one person in this room, that doesn't have their heart in the right place in terms of trying to do the right thing. But it seems to end up quite often in a polarized discussion, and if I contributed to that at any point in time, I apologize for that, because I should not have. But this is an issue that is the most difficult one, I think, right now facing the city, and one that I think we're making progress on in terms of the earlier discussion and some of the things that are being pursued there, some of the money that I hope is going to come our way that we need for supportive housing and other things, and some of the changes this report will bring about. And I just hope we can move forward and do that together, as opposed to it being a divisive subject. The people who need the help are relying on us to do that job, and I certainly want to be a leader in getting that done. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Okay, we have one amendment by Councillor Ainsley. Recorded vote.
Councillor Karygiannis, Councillor Bailão.
The amendment carries. The vote is 38-1.
Okay, item as amended, recorded vote.
Councillor Wong-Tam.
Councillor Palacio, please. Thank you. Councillor Crisanti and Councillor Robinson, please. Councillor Robinson, please.
The item is amended, carries unanimously, 39 in favor.
Okay, so our next item on the agenda, which is the famous 252242 Kill Street, been with us at least a couple of years. Unfortunately, Councillor DeGiorgio is working on motions that he hasn't prepared yet, so we have to
For those of you that have been around for a long time, you may remember the infamous 1555 Jane Street. And you'll remember that took about 5 years to resolve. This is basically a carbon copy of 1555 Jane Street. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Whoa.
Well, there's still 5 years on this one as well.
So, Councillor DeGiorgio, are you saying you're not ready to deal with it yet? You want to wait till tomorrow? Tomorrow?
He wants to wait till hell freezes over.
I believe that everybody's moved in and they're living there. Well, okay, and I'm sure they'll be voting this year too. Okay, quick releases. Oh no, sorry, not quick releases. Sorry. I got a little bit excited there. So our next item is on page 3, EX 32.3, which is Financial Management and Control Bylaw Review and Update. Councillor Davis, you held the item down. Do you have questions to staff? Okay, questions to staff. If anybody has any questions, request to question staff.
When were we supposed to get the update on the financial control bylaw? Do you recall, Mr. Farag?
Well, the last update was, believe it or not, in 2000.
In 2000.
It was intended to be revisited every 5 years.
Right.
So it's long overdue.
Long overdue. And we've been operating within the existing interim control bylaw without consequence. Sorry, the financial control bylaw, without any serious consequences?
Yeah, so over the course of time, Council
Okay.
has adopted a number of policies that are not really entrenched in a bylaw.
Right. So this proposal before us is going to entrench, as you say, in the financial control bylaw, very detailed budget process. Would you say that?
Yes, through the Speaker, it does deal with a number of budget matters. It deals with a number of reporting matters. It deals with a variety of policies that currently exist that are not contained in the bylaw itself.
And was it not the case that these proposals were supposed to come at the same time as the long-term financial plan, so that we could ensure that they reflected each other or they were coordinated?
Certainly, through the Speaker, that was always the intent, is that the
Okay.
two accompany one another.
And now the long-term financial plan has gone off to be dealt with in the next couple of years or the next term. So these are not going to be companion documents at this point, is that correct?
Yes, that is a fair characterization.
So this entrenches a budget process that we've been using for some time. Are there any other municipalities that have such detailed, that you're aware of, that have such detailed budget process and other financial management policies entrenched in theirs?
Through the Speaker, so my understanding is that staff have in fact consulted with at least a dozen other municipalities as well as organizations, and
I understand best
the bylaw that's before you is really in keeping with good practices that have been adopted
But
by
are
those
there other
municipalities.
municipalities? Maybe I can get that offline, because I'm not aware of other municipalities that have this kind of?
Well, I have a list of at least a dozen.
Okay, that were consulted. I'm asking if they have detailed budget processes and financial practices in their bylaws.
Yes, they
I'm not aware of that. Okay, I will ask you later. So these budget processes were also addressed in the long-term financial plan. Is that correct? Maybe I should ask the city manager.
Well, I could respond to that. Yes, they were.
And in fact, doesn't the long-term financial plan say that the budget process has reached its practical limit as a way to provide proper oversight to a $17 billion organization? Does it not go on to recommend that we need to change the decision-making process structures and tools, that we need to have a risk analysis and better information given to council for strategic decision-making? And does it not also say that the policy and financial processes need to be integrated in order to have a better budget process and that we have a solid long-term fiscal plan? Are those all the basic recommendations in the long-term fiscal plan?
Through the Speaker, there's no question there could be improvements made to the budget process, which would entail many of the items that you've just identified, Councillor.
Right. In fact, it talks as well about better engagement processes with the public. It talks about providing better information through the entire budget process. So one would hope, and I presume you would, that we are going to improve the budget process coming out of the long-term financial plan. Would that be your hope as well?
Certainly, that is an objective of financial planning and the Finance Department.
So why would it be that we would entrench the old budget process in our bylaws? At the same time, we are launching on, and you are doing work to change those very processes to prepare us for changes in the long-term fiscal plan in the new year.
With respect, I don't believe the two are inconsistent. I think we're codifying certain rules, certain best practices in the financial control bylaw.
Okay, let me ask
another way. And that does not negate the fact that we're going to continue to make improvements.
Councillor Davis, that was your last question, sorry. Councillor Perks, are you...
Was it?
Need our solicitor here? Do we have the solicitor here? Oh, there you are. Okay. Councillor Perks.
So, thank you very much, Speaker. Through you to the City Solicitor. There are a number of elements in the proposal here which change what is currently a council practice or policy into something codified in a municipal bylaw. If during next year or 2 years from now we want to change it in the middle of a budget process, is the process for amending a bylaw as simple as changing a council policy?
A policy that is adopted by council has really the same status as a bylaw, and so the reopening rule does apply to that as well. The only there are some bylaws that require 2/3, like the procedure bylaw, but otherwise, changing a council decision, whether it is in a bylaw or in a policy adopted by council, is effectively the same.
So we've run into issues on some of our bylaws, and I'm being belts and suspenders here, where affected stakeholders have taken us to court that we didn't give an opportunity for them to come and make deputations on a bylaw amendment. If we made a budgetary decision that effectively amend this bylaw without going through a process like that, would we be safe, or would we be open to someone challenging that we had amended a city bylaw in a way that affected them financially without giving them an ability to come and make a deputation?
It's difficult to respond to that as a hypothetical. However, should something like that occur, I would anticipate that the Chief Financial Officer and the City Solicitor would manage that so that any amendment was addressed through proper notice and public consultation.
But this is exactly the dilemma. So we come to a budget debate, And so, for example, there's something here about the allocation of surplus. There's another thing here which sets the cap on how much debt repayment we can have. This writes them into a bylaw. If we were to make a change by council motion in a way that didn't debate them on the executive committee or the budget committee, where not all of us are members and not all of us have the right to move motions, and it had an effect on some business out there or some other stakeholder, I believe there's an actual legal decision where, I think it's the taxi issue, where because we didn't mention that in committee, we ran into a legal problem. And I understand that it's hypothetical, but I need to have that clarified for me before I can vote to approve these bylaw amendments that codify stuff in a bylaw.
So any decision that would effectively amend the provisions of the bylaw would have to be accompanied by a bylaw, like a bill, to amend the bylaw, and any procedural requirements should be followed in those instances. I am familiar with the decision you're talking about, and in that case, the court found that public consultation was required because it was a requirement of fairness and good faith, given that the change that council was making would have affected the business of a particular sector of the business community in a significant way. So that it's a little bit different, but I appreciate what you're saying. There are instances where changes to a financial control bylaw might warrant public notice and consultation.
So by approving this, we create the possibility, and I realize you haven't had time to test this in detail, but I did ask this of your staff at Executive Committee. The possibility exists that if we approve this, and then during a future budget debate, someone moves to amend the Executive Committee recommended budget in a way that changes the requirements in the bylaw we are about to pass, that theoretically someone could take us to court because we did not consult with them at committee, and they are a subsection of the Toronto population who is affected by that change.
What I can say is that in that instance, a bill would be required and an amendment to the financial control bylaw would be required. Whether notice would be required and consultation, it's very fact specific. And you know, I'm reluctant to say that it would be.
But you're also reluctant to say it would not.
I can envision a number of situations where it would not, but I'm reluctant to say either way without facts.
You're reluctant to say either way.
I am, yes.
So I can't go with assurances and vote in favor of this without knowing whether or not I've created that risk. I just can't know from your answer.
Okay. I would like to think that in voting for this, council is reasonably certain, if they choose to vote for, that they're reasonably certain they would not want to change it come budget time, yes. Because you could run into, yeah.
Okay, now I understand. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Janet, she did say it.
Councillor Carroll.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I just wanted to clarify some questions about engagement in the budget process part of the bylaw, because that doesn't necessarily fit easily into bylaw language. So the bylaw may be silent, but it may still be your intention. So the first question, of course, is the bylaw now states we're going to set targets and staff are going to do a review and then the budget committee will do it. Is it still going to be the case that while we're still in the staff review and prior to staff launching their draft budget, that one or two budget committee members will give informal input? Is that still a possibility?
I do not believe that anything changes by adoption of this bylaw, that councillors and committee members will continue to provide input.
Okay. And then as to the community, I'm sure you're aware, well, it's a shame Ms. Levita isn't here because she was actually present for the presentation. Toronto Youth Cabinet and other youth bodies were fairly vocal this past year that what they'd like to see is a real consultation with community members, a broad consultation before we embark upon a budget, before we've launched a budget. And the way the bylaw is structured, that would pretty much have to happen before council is nailing down targets. Otherwise, there wouldn't be much point to that consultation. Is that still being contemplated or worked on, or are you waiting for political direction for such a thing?
No, I think that is entirely within staff's discretion to pursue more engagement as part of the budget process. And in discussions with Ms. Levita, our intention is to fully commence early engagement into the process.
So it's possible that now that we're being far more, we're being, and it's not that this isn't welcome. We have for a long time wondered who's doing this target business, and we have now moved to council adopting a target. But it happens generally so early and so quickly that most of us have not consulted even with our own local communities. Could that consultation happen before targets are set?
Yes, absolutely, you can.
Okay, thank you.
That's it for the questions. To speak, Councillor Davis.
Thank you, Speaker. I have a motion that's been advance circulated in green, and I know it's difficult sometimes when there's a motion that's long, that somehow it seems really complicated. It is not. It is quite simple. We have before us amendments to the Financial Management and Control Bylaw, it's now being called. And in this report, in Appendix 1, it sets out all of the changes and the existing bylaw that governs how our corporation functions with respect to ensuring that our financial controls are sound and that they govern everything we do. However, what is before us as well are a set of new provisions that embed for the first time in the financial management, in the financial control bylaw, a series of budget processes that have just simply been processes that we as a council have set. They are detailed and they are specific. And they say very clearly that this is how the budget process will be run this year. They also set out what we intend to do in terms, it also includes, for the first time, provisions that relate to the debt service and the debt service limits. That is new. It also contains in here for the first time and embedded in our bylaw how we manage the surplus. It embeds in here how we do the budget process, the capital plan, and it also includes a series of other controls around the capital budget. Now, I am not on the face of this suggesting that these might not be practices that we will continue. But what they are is the status quo. And we are about to move into, presumably in the new council, a new way to approach the financial planning of this corporation. Yesterday, we didn't actually debate, but we tried to debate the provisions that were set out in the new financial long-term plan. And in that plan, and I read them out in my questions to the acting CFO, it says very clearly we need to change the budget process. It says that we need to make sure that we are strategic and focused. We need to make sure that we get better and more focused information. It says we should be having a risk analysis and an annual risk report. It says that we should be integrating policy and financial processes in a multi-year strategy. So why, after 17 years, are we about to embed in a financial control bylaw practices that this very report says have to change? If we don't think that this current budget process works, then why are we doing it now? This simply says we don't need these provisions right now, Let's look at those in the new year, in the new term. One of the things that is clear to me is that the way that we set targets, the way that we engage our communities, and the way we integrate financial decisions with policy decisions is not working. We also have recognized, and the city manager and the CFO recognized again this year, that we need to be examining our debt targets and our debt ceilings. And I see the CFO nodding his head. Why would we put back in here the very policy that we say is not working? We also have in here a series of practices that I know we don't really understand in terms of the capital constraints on the capital budget. This says you get a capital budget, you stick to it, and if you don't have that money, then you find it somewhere else. I'm not sure that this is a practice that we want embedded in the financial bylaw. So I just believe yesterday that we should integrate the long-term financial plan and the fiscal control bylaw in the new term. If we're going to do it, then remove these provisions and let the others go ahead.
Thank you. Councillor, there are no questions. Councillor Carroll?
No, there are no questions. I'm not even sure that many of us have had a chance to review this. Madam Speaker, I only rise to underscore the question that I asked of the CFO and to remind people that it is going to come back to you. I dare say as a ballot issue amongst youth, and if not as a ballot issue amongst youth, it will definitely knock you right between the eyes the minute you begin your post-election budget process. What youth are saying to us again and again, and even some of the not so young, but particularly some of the people amongst our own Toronto Youth Cabinet, is that they want a chance to talk about where the budget should go and what they would like to see in terms of how accessible it is to them, how readable it is to them, and what they can really truly anticipate over the next 3 years. And they want to have the conversation before it is too late. They want to give us broad advice, not just give us a candy store for this one thing, but they want to be able to give broad advice about what they see as the direction the budget should be going to serve them now and into their future, since they are the future. I'm talking about the 20-somethings that spoke so eloquently about this during our most recent budget process. And what they're saying is, if you're going to set a target and then draw a line under that, and next you're going to launch a budget and draw a line under that, then our parents and all the people 20 or 30 years older than us kind of see it all as a known quantity, they breathe a sigh of relief, and they don't talk much. We spend a longer time looking at it, and we would really like to be talking to you about it before any of those things happen. And all that means is, what they're asking for is something that we have done before. Start your term of office. I'm not talking about doing this every year, because this very bylaw recommends thinking in 3-year cycles in operating and 10 in capital. What we're talking about is begin each term of office with a broad consultation that allows them to tell you before you nail down even your first target. Here's where we really feel you should be going. If by chance, and you never know, if by chance the campaign season doesn't really nail down those things, you can't really say you have 100% of a mandate to do very, very specific things just 6 weeks later. So what they want, thank you for the silent applause from a young person sitting in the audience. Would that they were all here. Riley Peterson would be running around in circles up there. What they want to see is that one opportunity, we used to call it listening to Toronto, at the beginning of a term of office. And then you can say, we did listen, and based on what we heard, We're now setting a target for this year and into the future because we think we hear where you want us to go. We think we can get there over the course of a term without selling everything in the candy store in the first budget year, but we really get what you want. That's all they're asking, and I don't think it's a lot to ask. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you. Do we have any further speakers on the item? Okay, Councillor Perks?
Speaker, I find myself in a bit of a quandary here. I'm trying to work through a motion that may be of assistance, but I'm not ready yet, and we're out of speakers. Can I ask that we stand this down for a moment?
Sure.
Thank you very much, Speaker.
Do we have any further speakers on the item? No? Councillor Fillion, are you ready with yours? Well, why don't we get to the item and see if there are any questions to staff? No, but other members may have questions to staff. No. No, this is to do with third-party sign tax. Okay. What's on the executive? Okay, so Deputy Mayor Minawong, do you want to get to your EX 32.8?
Carbon?
Yeah.
I'll release it.
Okay, on EX 32.8.
There were two other people that were interested in holding it. One was Councillor. Oh, all right. What? Oh, it's Councillor Thompson. Are you? Pardon? You want to hold it? I'm releasing my hold to Councillor Thompson.
Okay, Councillor Thompson,
I don't think he has to give a reason, Councillor Margaret.
No, but Councillor Thompson, we're at the item now.
Okay, Councillor McMahon.
But we're at the item. Okay, well, I don't know what we're going to do because everybody's holding them all down. Do we have questions to staff?
Not ready as yet, Speaker.
Not ready. On page 3, EX 32.1, Councillor Wong Tam. Do you have questions to staff?
Oh, Madam Speaker. Oh, sorry.
We have questions to staff?
No, Madam Speaker. I'm prepared to release it. I was going to move a motion on it, but I think it's better to just leave it alone. So if we can just adopt the recommendations from the Executive Committee.
Okay, on page 3, EX 32.11, Councillor Wong Tam is releasing. Recorded vote. We're not doing quick releases. We're going through the because we're going through the agenda. Shortly.
Councillor Fillion, please.
Councillor Prudsa, Councillor DeGiorgio. Councillor DeGiorgio and Councillor Prudsa, please.
Councillor Crisanti, when you're seated, please.
Councillor DeGiorgio, please.
The item is adopted unanimously, 41 in favor.
Fillion, are you ready to ask questions? Yeah, but do we have questions to staff? Okay, Councillor Davis, questions to staff. We're going to at least start the questions. This is, other people have questions. Councillor Fillion, we're not going to hold the whole agenda up. Okay, EX 32.4, Councillor Davis, this is the third-party sign tax. Questions to staff.
Just to finance staff, please. We approved the sign tax in what year? 2010?
Yes.
And between 2010 and now, have we increased the tax?
The tax has increased by roughly 9%, and inflation has been 15%.
That was going to be my second question. So all the fees at the City of Toronto have increased at least by the rate of inflation. That's been our practice. Is that, I know this is a tax, but our user fee policy, for instance, don't we charge the residents now an annual inflation rate on all user fees?
Yes, through the chair, most fees rise by the rate of inflation.
So the tax was also identified. Speaker, I cannot hear. So the tax came before us when we first discussed the long-term financial plan and the revenue tools. Is that correct?
Yes, it certainly came before us back in 2009, 2010.
And at that point, no, past that, subsequent to that, we looked at potential increases, and I recall it was 25% that we were talking about introducing in terms of increases in the tax. Is that correct?
There was a direction to look at that as an option, yes.
Okay. So if we were to look at the gap between inflation and what the rates or the tax has gone up, what is that difference?
In the last 7 years, that is 6.2%.
So 6.2% is what generally we would have increased almost everything else here at the city. You are going to be reporting back as a result of a motion from Executive Committee to consult further with the industry. Would you be able to report back in 2019 with options for increasing the tax through the budget process to reflect that gap in inflation?
Yes, through the chair.
And does that, I know that there has been a great deal of resistance to increases to the sign tax, but do you think it's reasonable that we should tax the sign companies at least at the same rate we're taxing our residents?
Certainly that would be reasonable.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Holliday, questions?
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Through you to the Chief Building Official and her staff. I wondered if somebody could just explain to me the mechanics of attachments number 1 and 2. And specifically when I was looking at the descriptions of the different sign classes in each of these two amendments, they were different. I would note in attachment number 2, classes 2 through to 5 include electronic signs. In the first attachment, they do not. And I needed to be comfortable with what the attachments meant.
Who's supposed to answer the question?
Through the chair, I'll answer that question.
I'll put your time on hold.
Okay, the smaller electronic signs were put into classes 2, 3, and 4.
Is that occurring in this specific report, or do we do that already?
It's occurring in this specific report through the chair.
We're adding electronic signs as eligible underneath the different classes. Are we allowing the electronic signs to become eligible to be installed or eligible to be taxed? I wonder if you could differentiate between the two.
Eligible to be taxed.
Do we currently allow electronic signs to be installed that are described in the various class categories? Or is that dealt with through a different mechanism?
It's through the sign bylaw, and we do allow them.
Okay, so through the sign bylaw allows the permissions for the installation of the signs. The current report before us is simply, if I got it right, the current report before us is simply catching up to the sign bylaw to allow us to tax them in a manner specifically to how we've changed the sign bylaw.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
So in summary, we're not being more permissive with signs today. We're simply fixing our bylaws so that we can tax them effectively in your estimation.
Through the chair, yes, that's correct.
Okay, and if you could just help me understand why the list of the sign categories are different between attachment 1 and 2.
Attachment 1 takes effect immediately. Attachment 2 takes effect in January.
Okay. So the electronic signs then are added next January. Okay, so they're just sequential changes to the same thing.
Correct.
I think this is very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do we have any further questions on the third-party signs? No? Okay. Councillor Fillion to speak.
First, I'll read my motion that City Council request the Treasurer in consultation with the Chief Building Official and Executive Director, Toronto Building, to consider the development and application of an annual surcharge on signs that are not authorized under Chapter 694 Signs General, and to report back prior to the 2019 budget process. So it's just a report request. I think this report before us is a missed opportunity. We, need to be looking for more sources of revenue, and what we've done basically is leave everything flat for 2018, and for 19 keep revenue flat by decreasing some and increasing others and having the whole thing come out as a wash. I think we certainly could have done a lot more in the way of increases, probably less in the way of decreases, but when I went to try to amend it, it's also interwoven that the staff convinced me that it would have caused them a lot of technical difficulties and perhaps even legal difficulties were I to try to just make an amendment. So I'm willing to live with the staff recommendations, but I would like to look at how we can increase revenue under this stream by increasing the fees on the signs that do not meet the sign bylaw. So these are signs that we basically don't want. So I think it's totally appropriate to charge a greater fee onto them. I have no idea what that might amount to. That would be the subject of the staff report, but whatever it is, we can certainly use the money. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Burnside has a question for you.
Thank you. Just for clarification, so if there is a sign that has been approved by council but it doesn't meet the bylaws, that's what you're talking about, a surcharge on those signs?
Yes, I'm talking about a report for a surcharge on those signs, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Deputy Mayor Minnan-Wong, question?
Yeah, so those signs that don't meet the bylaw, are you referring to signs that have been grandfathered?
It could include signs that are grandfathered. I'm not referring to any particular signs. That's what you gave is one example. What Councillor Burnside gave is another example. I'm just asking for a staff report to examine whether we can impose a higher tax on signs that don't meet the sign bylaw.
So these would include signs that people built that conformed with the bylaw that they're not changing because, well, they did it in good faith. Now we changed the law on them, and you want to make them pay a surcharge.
Again, I'm just asking for a staff report. So I'm asking for the staff to kind of look at what would fall under this category and what they would recommend as far as increases in fees, if any, and that would be a report that would come to council next year.
Thank you. Sounds like communism to me.
Councillor Davis to speak.
Thank you, Speaker. I have a motion, and it asks that City Council request the Treasurer to, and this is the addition, this is the amendment that's underlined, to develop an option that increases total taxes by approximately 6.2%, representing the difference between inflation and rate increases since 2010. Colleagues, we introduced a sign tax in 2010, and there has been approximately a 9% increase over that period of time, but inflation has been at 15.2%. So the intent of my motion is to ask for our staff to come back in the 2019 budget process with an option to look at filling the gap over those years to reflect the actual cost of inflation. We have charged our residents through user fees and through property taxes the equivalent of an increase in inflation every year since 2010, and I don't believe for a moment that we shouldn't be taxing the big sign companies at least that amount. We came into this discussion early in 2010 knowing that there are many, many people, including me, who find that the introduction of huge digital signs into our public spaces are intrusive and along the sides of our highways unsafe. But we do have a sign bylaw that permits them in certain districts. What this is going to do is tax them to reflect the incredible revenue that is generated from those signs. What is before us is a report that is a net zero revenue report, as Councillor Fillion pointed out. And if you were at Executive Committee, you would have heard that there were deputants who came and spoke in support of the report, and there were deputants who came and spoke against it. The companies that have the small signs believe that their only option, because of the tax rate we were taxing them at, was to tear down small signs and go for the big ones. The big companies, and so they supported the report. The big sign, digital sign companies came and said, oh, you're going to tax us too much, because we are lowering the tax on the small signs and we are increasing the tax on the large signs to make it more reflective of what we believe the revenue comes from those signs. But it does not recommend any increases to give us any additional revenue. And I think when Mr. Saint-Amand answered my final question, is it reasonable to look at ensuring that the inflation rate from 2010 to 2000 and what will be 19 is reflected in our sign tax? I would argue as well it is. And I hope that you will support this recommendation to be considered in the 2018 budget process. Thank you.
Further speakers? Okay, can we put the amendment on? Recorded vote, yeah.
Councillor Karygiannis, please. Councillor Perruzza, when you're seated. Councillor Kelly. Councillor Perruzza, please.
Yep. The amendment carries. The vote is 26 to 14.
Okay, so on Councillor Davis's amendment. Recorded vote.
Councillor Perruzza. Councillor McMahon. Councillor Perruzza. Councillor McMahon, please.
The amendment does not carry. It loses on a tie vote, 20 aside.
On the item as amended, recorded vote.
The mayor was on. Thank you, Mayor Tory. Well done, Mayor Tory. Where should we
Councillor Perruzza, please. Councillor Cressy. Councillor Wong Tam, please. Councillor Perruzza, your vote, please.
The item as amended carries. The vote is 34 to 6.
Councillor Karygiannis, you have your name up there. Is there a reason? Okay, can you just... Okay, before we recess, there's a number of members' motions that we'll introduce at this time, and then we'll recess. No, we're going to do that when we come back. Pardon? Councillor Matlow. Okay, members, we need 30 members to be in here to introduce these members' motions. Can you please take your seat? No, we'll do that when we come back. Councillor Matlow?
Madam Speaker, I move this.
Okay. The motion is on the screen. All in favor? Carried. Okay, you have another one? On the screen,
Madam Speaker, if I may, if I can just check to staff, has the typo been dealt with? And if I can't get a confirmation, then I will have to hold this down. You don't know?
What's the typo?
Okay, I'm going to hold this down for the moment.
This is just introducing
Oh, this is just introducing
it.
Excuse me. Then I move this too.
On favor? Carried. Please, can we hold? There's a lot of noise. Councillor Shiner, Councillor Ainslie, please. Just a couple more minutes. Councillor Cressy.
Thank you, Speaker. I have two items. If the first can be put on the screen. This is urgency as a consultation has been scheduled already this spring.
On favor? Carried. And you have a second one?
Yeah, and I have I have a second one, and it's an AGCO matter, and it's urgent as the hearing date has been scheduled.
This is for cats. The other one was for dogs.
On favor? Carried. Councillor Shiner.
What do I have?
Introduction.
Which motion do I have to introduce? Oh, which one?
Yes, I have a motion to introduce without notice in regards to an extension of the deadline for the Toronto Local Appeal Body.
On favor? Carried. Councillor Karygiannis.
Yes, Madam Chair. I have a motion to introduce it. Madam Chair, this is on February the 27th, there was a young man that was killed in my area, and I'd like to introduce a motion. There's an outcry that we need to move faster on having traffic calming measures, and I want to thank the Mayor for seconding this.
On favor? Carried. Okay, recess to 6:30. Oh, what about Councillor Grimes? Oh, it wasn't ready.